Harper Audio presents Skin by Ben Mezrich, performed by Bruce Harwood. Fox Mulder lay back against the motel mattress, listening to the bray of the television in the background. He heard the shower go on in the adjacent room and groaned, lifting himself back to a sitting position on the edge of the bed. He and Scully had a long drive back to the airfield in Westchester, New York. Mulder was about to get up and start packing when something on the television screen caught his eye. A reporter was speaking into a microphone as she wandered through what looked to be a hospital hallway. Behind her was a spider web of yellow police tape. Even through the tape, Mulder could make out the disaster scene in the room on the other side of the hallway, the torn, blood-spattered mattress, the IV rack sticking straight out of a wall, and most disturbing of all, the strange indentation in the center of the half-open wooden door. It was the indentation that had caught his attention in the first place, because it seemed somehow familiar. "The sheer violence of yesterday's tragedy has shocked local authorities," the CNN reporter droned into her microphone, "and a borough-wide search for Professor Stanton is presently in full swing. Still, this is little comfort to the family of Nurse Terry Nestor." The picture on the screen changed as the reporter continued on, and Mulder found himself staring into a pair of intelligent blue eyes. The man in the photograph looked to be about 55 years old, with thinning brown hair and slightly oversized ears. Even from the cropped photo, Mulder could tell he was a small man. He was staring at Stanton's kind blue eyes when the picture on the television changed again. This time, he was looking at a close-up of the marred, half-open door. He took a step closer to the screen. Suddenly he realized what he was looking at. An imprint of a human hand set a few inches deep into the heavy oak. Palm wide open, fingers splayed outward. What kind of force would it take to make an imprint of a hand in a heavy oak door? He quickly moved to the small desk in the other corner of the hotel room and reached for the phone. He dialed the number for the New York FBI Bureau office and spoke quietly to the operator, detailing the request he wanted forwarded to the NYPD Homicide Division in charge of the Stanton investigation. Then he replaced the receiver and made sure his fax machine was in the auto-receiving mode. He crossed to the closet door, pausing along the way to retrieve the soggy towel he had dropped on the floor by the bed. He wrapped the towel around his open right hand and stood facing the unmarked wood. He shut his eyes, drew back, and slammed his right hand into the center of the door. There was a sharp crack, and Mulder grimaced. He pulled back and saw fractures in the surface of the wood, expanding outward from the point of impact. The cracks were noticeable, but nothing like the deep indentations he had seen in the CNN report. A sudden knock interrupted his thoughts, followed by a muffled female voice. "Mulder? Is everything okay?" Mulder quickly crossed to the hotel room door and undid the latch. Dana Scully was standing in the narrow hallway, her rust-colored hair dripping wet. It was obvious she had dressed quickly. "What's going on in here? It sounded like someone was brawling with the furniture." Mulder smiled. "Not the furniture, just the closet door. Sorry if I interrupted your shower." Scully stepped past him into the room. She stopped in front of the closet door and took in the cracked dent in the center of the wood. "Scully, how often do patients try to kill their doctors?" Scully raised her eyebrows. "Mulder, we need to get packed and on the road if we're going to make it back to Washington tonight. A patient wakes up from an operation, vulnerable, drugged up, exhausted, and the first thing he does is erupt in a violent rage. How often, Scully? Rarely? Almost never?" Scully was looking at him intently. "What are you getting at, Mulder?" Before Mulder could answer, a high-pitched warble reverberated through the room. The fax machine coughed to life, and Scully turned, startled. Did someone kill a doctor? Mulder followed a few paces behind as she crossed to the fax machine. Not exactly. A nurse named Terry Nestor. But he did more than kill her. He destroyed his recovery room. He shoved an IV rack through the wall. Then he put his right hand 2 inches into a heavy oak door. Scully lifted up the first 3 pages and began to leaf through them. Mulder could see her analytical mind going to work as she read the preliminary forensic evaluation he had requested from the homicide investigation. They had the man's picture on CNN, Scully. A small, gentle-looking professor. The kind of guy who gave me better grades than I deserved in college because he didn't want to hurt my feelings. Scully continued to read the pages coming out of the fax machine as she spoke from a corner of her pursed lips. People kill for many reasons. Sometimes they kill without reasons, and we both know that size doesn't matter. The human body can perform miracles of violence when properly provoked. Drugs, fear, pain, adrenaline, all these things can incite impressive acts of violence. And all these things are closely associated with hospital stays. This looks like a local homicide investigation, not a federal case. Scully paused, mid-sentence. Mulder looked at the page at the top of the pile in her hands and saw what appeared to be some sort of medical chart. "What is it?" Mulder asked. "It's the preliminary autopsy report on the murdered nurse," Scully responded. "There's obviously been some sort of error." Mulder waited in silence as Scully continued reading the report. Finally, she looked up from the pages in her hands. According to this autopsy report, Terry Nestor's skull was crushed with the approximate force of 2 vehicles moving at more than 30 miles per hour. 2 hours later, Dana Scully squared her shoulders as they approached the group of uniformed officers standing in front of the yellow police tape. She counted at least 3 men and 2 women, all wearing NYPD insignia. The officers looked up as Scully and Mulder advanced the last few steps. Scully quickly slipped her ID out of her jacket pocket. "FBI, I'm Special Agent Dana Scully. This is my partner, Agent Mulder. We're looking for the detective in charge of the Stanton case." The nearest officer gestured with his head towards the yellow tape. The door behind the tape was half open, and Scully could just make out the hand-shaped indentation in the center of the wood. They paused in the room's entrance. Scully's gaze was drawn to the huge sheets of yellow paper taped over the shattered picture windows. To the right of the windows was a contorted steel shelving unit. The warped hospital bed sat in the center of the room, the torn mattress sticking straight out of the deformed steel frame. 2 men in white jumpsuits were leaning over the mattress with handheld vacuums, collecting hair and fiber evidence. The degree of damage was exactly as Mulder had described it from the CNN report. It certainly didn't look like the work of one man. "Judging from the suits, I presume you're the 2 FBI agents your Manhattan Bureau warned us about," a gravelly voice erupted from behind the contorted shelving unit. Scully watched as a heavy-set woman in a dark gray suit stepped into view. She had a clipboard in her gloved hands, and there were dark bags under her dull blue eyes. "Detective Jennifer Barrett, NYPD." Scully made the introductions and, after a few pleasantries, turned the focus toward the case at hand. "It's our understanding that Perry Stanton is the only suspect in the murder. Is that based on the forensic evidence?" Barrett nodded. "From what we've gathered so far, Stanton was alone with the nurse when the murder took place. According to the plastic surgeon, Dr. Alec Bernstein, they were in the room for less than 5 minutes with the door shut when the violence started. Hair, fiber, and fingerprint surveys concur with Bernstein's story. Nobody entered the room through the door, and the windows are more than 20 feet above the parking lot." "A long way up," Mulder commented, "and an equally long way down." The detective pulled up a corner of the yellow paper. "The way down's a lot easier than the way up. The trick is in the landing. Stanton got lucky and hit some shrubs at the edge of the parking lot. We found torn pieces of his hospital smock in the branches along with more of Terry Nestor's blood. A manhunt is progressing rapidly through the borough, but so far, we've been unable to pick up his trace." "So the professor woke up from a skin graft," Mulder said out of the corner of his mouth, "tore up a hospital room, crushed his nurse's skull, then fell out of a 2-story window into a shrub. And he's still managing to evade a police search? Hey, you want to bring in your own forensic people? I'd be happy to hear an alternative story, because the media's already crawling up my ass on this one. We got a pathologist redoing the autopsy. We had the fingerprint team in here a dozen times, and it's still coming up the same. 1 perp, 1 dead nurse, 1 manhunt. And I don't care how fancy you fibbies think you are not going to find anything different." Scully decided to intervene before Mulder could aggravate her further. "We're not here to get in the way of your manhunt, Detective Barrett, just to assist in catching the perp. As for Professor Stanton, is there anything in his history that could explain the sudden outbreak of violence?" Barrett grunted. Model citizen up until the transplant procedure. No priors, not even a speeding ticket. Married 16 years until his wife died last February. Teaches European history at the university. No history of alcohol or drugs? Scully asked. An occasional glass of wine on weekends, according to his daughter. According to her, he was a shy but happy man. He was the most content in the basement library of the university, which is where he got burned in the boiler accident. Certainly doesn't fit the psychotic profile, Mulder commented. He was standing by the horizontal IV rack, trying to gauge how deeply it was embedded in the wall. According to the preliminary autopsy report, he was 5'4", weighed 130 pounds. Scully, how much do you think this IV rack weighs? Or that mattress? Scully ignored Mulder's questions for the moment. She nodded towards the clipboard in Barrett's hands. Is that Stanton's medical chart? Barrett nodded, her eyes on Mulder as she handed over the chart. Dr. Bernstein has gone through this with me a few times already. He says there was nothing medically abnormal about Stanton and nothing that he thought would have provoked a psychotic episode. But something I've learned working homicide in New York for the past 20 years. People crack for no good reason. The chart was 6 pages long, full of scrawled medical descriptions and evaluations. Stanton had arrived at Jamaica's emergency room with a full-thickness, third-degree steam burn on his right thigh. He had also been complaining of difficulty breathing and had been given IV solumidol, a strong steroid. After his breathing had stabilized, he had been prepped and wheeled into an operating room. Dr. Bernstein had performed an escharotomy, cutting away the damaged skin around the burn to prepare it for transplant, and had then attached a section of donor skin over the burn site. The procedure had gone off without a snag. Stanton had awakened in the recovery room, complaining only of mild discomfort. If all had gone well, the temporary graft would have remained over the area of the burn for 2 weeks, at which time Stanton would have received a permanent matched graft from another part of his body. Although Scully wasn't a plastic surgeon, there didn't seem to be anything about the transplant procedure itself that would have caused Stanton's violent reaction. But there was something in the chart that struck Scully as a possible explanation. She moved next to Mulder and showed him the indication in the chart. Stanton was given a fairly large dose of solumidol, Mulder. It's an extremely potent steroid. There have been numerous documented cases of patients reacting violently to steroids, sort of an allergic neurological response. Rare, but definitely not unique. Mulder looked at the IV rack, bisecting the air between them. Steroidal rage? Scully, he was given the solumidol before the transplant procedure, but didn't explode until hours later. Scully shrugged. It doesn't have to be an immediate reaction. The neurotransmitters build up in the nervous system. The procedure itself could have aggravated his body's reaction, and when the anesthesia from the operation wore off, his psychosis detonated. Mulder looked skeptical. Wouldn't Dr. Bernstein have mentioned the possibility to Detective Barrett? Barrett was watching them from the window, her arms still crossed against her chest. I'm sure I would have remembered if he had. He's performing a laser surgery at the moment, but you can interview him again when he's finished. Scully peered through the glass window with genuine interest as Dr. Bernstein carefully navigated the laser scalpel across the enormous tattoo in the center of the patient's bared back. The red light shivered in the thin white smoke rising from the patient's skin as the outer cells vaporized under the intense pinpoint heat. When Bernstein was finally finished, he looked up from behind his surgical mask and noticed Mulder and Scully on the other side of the viewing windows. He said something to the nurse, then shut off the laser scalpel and stepped away from the patient. He pulled his mask down as he moved into the outer scrub room where Scully and Mulder waited. I'm guessing you're not here for a tattoo removal, Bernstein said. So how can I help you? Sorry to interrupt, Dr. Bernstein. I'm Agent Scully. This is Agent Mulder. We're here about Perry Stanton. Bernstein nodded. I'm not sure what I can tell you beyond what I've already told Detective Barrett. Mr. Stanton was fine when I left him in the recovery room, and when I returned, he had already gone through the window. It was a horrid sight, something I don't think I'll ever forget. Or understand. Scully tried to make her voice as sympathetic as possible. It's certainly a mystery, one we're working to understand. Along that line, I noticed that you ordered IV solumidol to help Mr. Stanton's breathing. Yes, Bernstein interrupted with a wave of his hand. Detective Barrett called me to ask about the solumidol after you spoke to her downstairs in the recovery room, and you're right. I should have made it clear to her in the first place. Personally, I don't believe the steroid had anything to do with his violent outbreak. He'd been put on similar steroids fairly recently, a bout with pneumonia. I believe it was 3 years ago. It's extremely unlikely that he would have developed such a fierce allergy in such a short time. Scully nodded. The Solumadol still wasn't ruled out, but as Bernstein had said, it was an extremely doubtful cause. Dr. Bernstein, what about the grafting procedure itself? Do you remember anything abnormal about the operation? I've performed hundreds of similar transplants. There were no hitches at all. The procedure took less than an hour. I cleaned up the burn, flattened out the donor skin, and stapled it onto Stanton's thigh and wrapped the area in sterile gauze. I would have changed the dressing in 3 days, then removed the graft in about 2 weeks when he was ready to accept the permanent transplant. So the donor skin is only temporarily attached? Mulder asked. That's right. The temporary graft isn't matched to the patient because it's intended to be rejected after a period of a couple of weeks. Then we graft a piece of the patient's own skin over the wound. In the meantime, the donor skin decreases the risk of infection, and it helps indicate when the burned area is ready to accept the permanent transplant. If the temporary graft isn't matched to the patient, Scully interrupted, what precautions are taken to make sure the graft isn't carrying something that could infect the patient with a communicable disease? Truthfully, very few on my end. The skin is transported to us from the New York Fire Department's skin bank. The bank is responsible for growing bacteriological cultures and for checking the skin for viral threats. But they themselves are guided by the medical histories provided by the donor hospital. There are a million things to look for, and it's impossible to cover every possibility. If a donor dies from something infectious, they don't accept his skin. But if he dies from an unrelated cause and happens to be carrying something, there is a chance that it will be passed on through a transplant. A slim chance, Mulder asked, or a serious risk? And could any of these transferred diseases affect a patient's brain, enough to send him into a violent rage? I would call it extremely rare, Bernstein replied, but possible. For instance, undetected melanomas have been known to spread through transplant procedures, and certain viruses could jump through the lower layers of the epidermis into the capillaries, but most of these diseases would have showed up in the donor patient. Such microbe-laden skin would never have been harvested in the first place. Not on purpose, Scully thought to herself, but people made mistakes. After the procedure, did Stanton exhibit any symptoms at all? Anything that might hint at a viral or a bacteriological exposure? Bernstein started to shake his head, then paused. Well, now that I think about it, there was one thing, but I can't imagine how it could be connected to such an outbreak of violence. He rubbed the back of his neck with his hand. A small circular rash right here on the nape of his neck. It looked like thousands of tiny red dots. I assumed it was some sort of cortisonal reaction. I'm not a specialist, but I can't think of any serious disease that presents like that. Scully wasn't sure if the strange rash was connected, but she filed it in her memory. She was trying to think if there was anything else they needed from the plastic surgeon when Bernstein glanced at his watch, then let out a ponderous sigh. I'm sorry, but I've got a facelift scheduled to start in a few minutes. If you have any more questions, I'll be in OR 4 down the hall. And if there are any breakthroughs in the case, please let me know. Terry Nestor was a personal friend, but Mr. Stanton was my patient. I know it's foolish, but I feel like I failed him somehow. He excused himself and exited the scrub room. When he was gone, Scully turned toward her partner. I think it's pretty clear what we need to do next. While Barrett continues her manhunt, we have to track down the donor's skin and find out if it was infected with anything that could have caused Stanton's violence. And we have to act quickly. We don't want any more of that harvested skin ending up on other patients. Scully, do you really think a virus can explain what happened in the recovery room? Absolutely. It's possible that Stanton caught something from the graft, something that could have affected his brain and his personality. Once we track down the graft, we'll be able to find out for sure. And then we'll know how to deal with Stanton when we find him, and what precautions Barrett's officers need to take in bringing him in. As Scully followed Mulder out into the hallway, she failed to notice the tall man watching from the now deserted operating room on the other side of the viewing windows. The man was dressed in a blue, orderly uniform, most of his young face obscured by a sterile white surgical mask. His skin was dark and vaguely Asiatic, his black hair cropped tight beneath a pink antiseptic cap. His narrow eyes followed the two agents until they disappeared from view. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a tiny cellular phone. He dialed quickly. A few seconds later, he began to speak in a low, nasal voice. The words were foreign, the tone rising and falling. There was a brief pause, then a deep voice responded from somewhere far away. The young man nodded, slipping the phone back into his pocket. An anticipatory tremor moved through his shoulders. Then he grinned, his high brown cheeks pulling at his mask. "Missing," Scully said, hanging up the phone as she and Mulder exited through the Jamaica Hospital ER. "They're unable to locate the 6 trays of harvested skin from which Stanton's transplant was taken." The administrator of the skin bank had assured Scully that the FBI would be notified the minute the missing trays had been located. He had also insisted that this was not a matter for alarm. Mistakes like this were not uncommon. And although he hadn't been able to find the harvested skin, the administrator had been able to give Scully the name and location of the donor corpse. Derek Kaplan, a current inhabitant of the New York Hospital morgue. After Scully hung up on the skin bank, she and Mulder headed directly to New York Hospital. Leif Eckelman was exactly the type of man Mulder had expected to find working a hospital morgue. "The 2 kids from the med school harvested the skin late Friday night," Eckelman mumbled as he crossed the room to a set of filing cabinets set flush against a cinder block wall. "Josh Kemper and a buddy of his, Mike, I think his name was." Eckelman pulled open one of the cabinets and began to search through the manila folders inside. "Here it is," Eckelman finally said, lifting a folder out of the cabinet. "Mike Lifton, that was the other kid's name. Both in their 3rd year at Columbia Med. They signed for your donor at 3:15 a.m. Derek Kaplan, Caucasian, mid-30s, blonde hair, blue eyes, locker 52. Mulder was already moving toward the wall of drawers. Scully turned to Eckelman as Mulder scanned the numbered labels. "May I take a look at the file?" Eckelman shrugged, handing her the folder. "Not much to see. Kaplan came into the ER complaining of chest pains, then died in the ICU of an aortic dissection. Had a donor card in his wallet. The skin boys got to him first because the van from the eye bank got stuck in the mess in the FDR drive. The big accident, you know. Collected 7 bodies that night, but only Kaplan had the vulture card." Mulder located the steel drawer with the number 52 written in black magic marker across its cardboard label. He grasped the handle and gave it a gentle yank. The drawer rolled outward with a mild metallic groan. Mulder cleared his throat. Scully looked up. Mulder pointed, and Scully's face momentarily blanched. The locker was empty. She quickly turned toward the ME's assistant. "Mr. Eckelman?" Eckelman laughed nervously. "Whoops! That's not good. Are you sure that's number 52? Mulder rechecked the label. "Is there any chance the body was moved?" Eckelman quickly crossed back to the file cabinet. Shouldn't have been, but sometimes they get switched around, especially on the busy nights. And Friday was a busy night. There's always a chance the kids put the body back in the wrong drawer." He paused as he pulled a handful of files out of the cabinet. He began reading to himself, and Mulder crossed back to Scully, who was still looking through Kaplan's chart. "Anything significant, Scully?" "Nothing noticeably viral, but we need the body to know for sure. Or at the very least, a sample of his skin." "I'll check the other 6 that came in that night and all of the empties. Odds are, we'll find our boy." Eckelman tucked the files under his right arm and hurried back to the storage wall. He began pulling open the drawers, humming nervously to himself as he worked. "Locker 53 is all right. 54 and 55 look good too. And here's another from the accident. Kid can't be more than 20. Eckelman paused mid-sentence as the next drawer slid to a stop by his knees. He began mumbling, half to himself. "Oh, no, this can't be right." Mulder moved forward as Eckelman hovered over the toe tag. "Derek Kaplan. It's him. But this doesn't make any sense." Mulder looked over the man's shoulder. The corpse was staring straight up, blue eyes wide open. It was immediately obvious what was wrong with the body. Derek Kaplan wasn't missing any skin. "Damn it! The little vultures must have skinned the wrong body." "The wrong body?" Mulder asked. Eckelman didn't respond. Instead, he bent down and began pulling open the bottom row of steel drawers, the empties. Each time he stared into another blank box, he cursed. You can't blame this on me. I didn't skin anybody. I wasn't even in here." Eckelman stopped as he suddenly realized he'd reached the last drawer. "Well, son of a bitch! Unless they double-stacked it in one of the other drawers, it's not here." Mulder looked at the row of open, empty drawers. "Can we at least figure out which body is missing?" "Probably the one that was originally slated for this drawer," Scully answered, pointing at Derek Kaplan's corpse. "Didn't you say this was supposed to contain one of the 7 brought in that same Friday night?" Eckelman nodded, returning to the stack of folders. John Doe, brought in to the ER from the scene of the big car accident I told you about. Also blonde, blue eyes, but mid to early 20s, with a dragon tattoo on his right shoulder." "Was the John Doe a trauma victim?" Scully asked. "Did he die from injuries sustained in the accident?" There was a pause as Eckelman read through the file. Then he shook his head. "Actually, no, there were no signs of external injuries. The 2 interns who worked on him didn't know what killed him. He went into arrest in the ER. They gave him a pretty good jolt with the paddles, but it didn't work. He was scheduled for an autopsy at 8 tomorrow morning." Mulder and Scully exchanged looks. "I better go report this," Eckelman grumbled, heading toward the door. Scully was looking through the John Doe's file. "We have to speak to those med students. If something was transmitted from this John Doe to Perry Stanton, they're the obvious link." The sky had turned a dull gray by the time Mulder trudged up the stone steps that led to the entrance of the J.P. Friedler Medical Arts Building on the Columbia campus. He and Scully had split up to reach the 2 med students as quickly as possible. It took Mulder a few minutes to reach the anatomy lab on the 3rd floor of the vast stone building. His gaze roamed over the cadaver tables, and then he caught sight of his quarry standing alone near the back of the room, bent over an open body bag. Lifton seemed completely entranced by the open body in front of him. He didn't look up until Mulder was a few feet away, and when he did, his eyes seemed glazed, far away, and there was a slight tremble in his upper lip. Lifton coughed. "Excuse me, I didn't hear you come in. Can I help you? Hope I'm not interrupting. I'm Agent Fox Mulder from the FBI. I tried your dorm room, but there was no one home. Your next-door neighbor told me I could find you here." "The FBI?" Lifton asked, his eyes wide. Lifton coughed again, and the sound was coarse, vaguely pneumatic. Mulder saw beads of sweat running down the sides of the kid's face. "Are you feeling all right, Mr. Lifton?" Call me Mike. I got a bit of a cold, and I've been working in here most of the night. Formaldehyde screws with my allergies." "What is this about?" "I need to speak to you about a skin harvest you and Josh Kemper performed last Friday night." Lifton took a tiny step back from the autopsy table, his hands falling to his sides. "Did we do something wrong?" "Well, we think you and Josh might have harvested skin from the wrong body." Lifton closed his eyes, his cheeks pale. "I thought something was wrong, but Josh insisted. He said Eckelman probably blew the tags. He said the body was close enough to the chart. Blonde hair, blue eyes, no outward trauma." "So what made you suspect it was the wrong body?" Lifton sighed, using his forearm to wipe the sweat off his forehead. "First there was the tattoo, a dragon, on his right arm, and then there was the strange rash." Mulder's instincts perked up. "What sort of rash?" Lifton pointed to a clear area of skin right below his hairline. "Here on the nape of his neck, a circular eruption, thousands of tiny red dots. Josh told me it was nothing, and it probably was. But if the guy had been in the ICU, it would have been on the chart. A straight shot from the ER, maybe it would have been missed, but not in the ICU." "After you finished the harvest," Mulder continued, "what did you do with the body?" Lifton looked at him. "We returned it to the morgue, of course." "To the same locker?" "Yeah, 50-something, 52 or 54. I've usually got a good head for numbers, but I've been practicing in here nearly every night this week. Lack of sleep, screws with everything. Mulder nodded. We need to get you checked out by a doctor right away. There might be a chance that you caught something from the John Doe. Lifton's face turned even paler. What do you mean? Did he die from some sort of infectious disease? We're not sure. That's why we need to get you checked out. Lifton's entire body seemed to sag as he thought about what Mulder was saying. Then Mulder noticed another tremor move through Lifton's upper lip, followed by a heavy cough. I think we should get you to an ER right away, just to be sure. He didn't know whether or not it was evidence of Scully's theory, but suddenly he didn't like the way Mike Lifton looked. It seemed as though Lifton's condition was deteriorating as he watched. As the student hastily repacked the open cadaver with trembling hands, Mulder hoped that Scully had gotten to the other med student in time. Mr. Kemper? Mr. Josh Kemper? Scully's voice reverberated off of the heavy apartment door. This is Agent Dana Scully of the FBI. The building superintendent is here with me, and if you don't answer the door, I'm coming inside. Scully could feel her heart pounding as she waited for a response. She glanced at the short, stocky man in the untucked gray t-shirt standing next to her and nodded. The super began fumbling through his oversized ring of apartment keys. Scully had called for an ambulance when she first arrived at the apartment building and found Kemper unresponsive to her attempts to get inside his room, but she knew it would be another few minutes before the paramedics would arrive. Here it is, the super finally exclaimed. The door came open and she rushed inside. Mr. Kemper? Josh? The living room was small and almost devoid of furniture, and dirty laundry invaded every inch of bare floor. Scully headed for the open doorway on the other side of the living room. There was a bare mattress in the middle of the room, covered in medical texts and science magazines. But still no sign of Kemper. The bathroom, she shouted back over her shoulder. Where is the bathroom? Off the bedroom. Scully cursed, her eyes wildly searching the cramped space. And then she saw the closed door, partially obscured by a sea of hanging colored beads. She shoved the beads aside and yanked the door open. There he was, shirtless, lying face down on the floor, one arm crooked around the base of the toilet, the other twisted strangely behind his back. Scully dropped to her knees and put her hand against the side of his neck. No pulse. No doubt about it, Josh Kemper was dead. Her shoulders sagged as she dialed Mulder's number. He answered on the second ring. Mulder, where are you? His voice sounded tinny through the phone's earpiece. The ER at Columbia Medical School. I take it you found Mike Lifton? Scully, he's not doing so well. When I brought him in, he was complaining of flu-like symptoms. Now the doctors tell me he's fallen into some sort of coma. Scully nodded to herself. We're going to have to notify the CDC immediately. They're going to want to track down anyone who's had serious contact with the John Doe, and they'll need to act fast. Obviously, the infected subject's conditions deteriorate rapidly. So Josh Kemper's pretty sick too? Scully took a deep breath. He's dead, Mulder. Whatever the John Doe is carrying, it progresses quickly. And you think it's the same disease that made Stanton kill Terry Nestor? Yes. Like I said before, it's some kind of microbe that causes a swelling of the brain. And Mulder, whatever Stanton was capable of in that recovery room or out in Brooklyn this morning, I don't think he'll be putting up much of a struggle in a few more hours. This is a fast-acting disease. Scully heard voices out in the apartment. The paramedics had arrived. I'm heading back to the hospital with Kemper's corpse. I'll find out what this microbe is, Mulder. And after I do, we're both going to get some sleep. For once, there was no argument from the other end of the line. 4 hours later, a triangle of harsh orange light ripped Mulder out of a deep sleep. He sat straight up on the borrowed hospital cot in the cozy third-floor intern room, blinking rapidly. Scully came into focus. She was wearing a white lab coat and gloves, and there was a plastic contact sheet in her right hand. "We found our microbe," she said, crossing into the room and dropping heavily onto the edge of Mulder's cot. She tossed the contact sheet onto his lap. These are shots of the isolated virus taken by an electron microscope. The sample came from Josh Kemper, and now it's been matched to samples taken from all of the other victims. Mulder looked at the contact sheet. He could see a tiny, pill-shaped object multiplied a half-dozen times in the different angled shots. "They woke me with the results from the lab 20 minutes ago," Scully continued. "But I went down there myself to check out what they're saying, because it's pretty hard to believe." "What do you mean?" "Scully, what am I looking at?" Scully took a deep breath. "Encephalitis lethargica. We've matched it up through the CDC's computer link. They're sending a specialist here this afternoon to confirm the diagnosis, but the EEGs and the CT scans coincide. There isn't any doubt." "So it's a form of encephalitis. Isn't that similar to what you predicted, a disease that would cause brain swelling?" "It is a strain of encephalitis, but Mulder, it's not at all what I expected. There hasn't been an outbreak of encephalitis lethargica since 1922. The virus you're looking at has rarely been seen outside of a laboratory in over 75 years. A few sporadic cases, but nothing like what we're witnessing." Mulder raised his eyebrows. "How does this virus manifest? Does it fit the symptoms we've seen?" Scully shrugged. "The disease starts similarly to the more common strains of encephalitis, causing fever, confusion, sometimes paralysis of one side of the body, and in some cases, convulsions, psychosis, coma, and death. But lethargica also induces incredible fatigue, which is why it's sometimes called the sleeping sickness." Mulder nodded. He remembered Mike Lifton's drooping eyelids and glazed eyes. "Scully, what about the circular rash on both the John Doe and Perry Stanton? Could that have been caused by encephalitis lethargica? And why wasn't it present on either of the med students?" "The rash might be unrelated, perhaps a separate infection, one that's more difficult to catch. Remember, the med students did not have the same level of contact with the John Doe as Perry Stanton. Stanton got a slab of his skin stapled onto an open burn. That still doesn't explain Stanton's violent explosion. Neither of the med students reacted violently." Scully waved her hand. "Viruses can affect different people differently, and especially a virus like this. Lethargica attacks areas of the brain as well as the meninges, the brain's covering. There's no way to predict how a specific individual might react. During the 1922 outbreak, 40% of those infected died. This time we're looking at much worse numbers, but at least the disease has been confined to the few people who had close contact with the carrier. That means the virus hasn't changed its mode of transmission." Mulder pushed his feet off the side of the cot, stretching his calves. "You mean it's bloodborne, like HIV?" "That's right. It's transmitted only by blood-to-blood contact." Mulder reached out and touched one of Scully's gloved hands. "Scully, both the med students were wearing gloves. How do you explain the blood-to-blood contact? A swarm of mosquitoes in the ER?" "Latex gloves aren't 100% protection, and a skin harvest is a messy procedure." "It doesn't seem right, Scully. Even if the virus links the med students to the John Doe, we don't have any proof of a link to Perry Stanton. If Dr. Bernstein was sick, maybe, but he's not. The only thing that connects the John Doe to Perry Stanton is the circular red rash." Scully rose slowly from the cot and took the contact sheet out of Mulder's hands. "We won't know for sure until we've got Stanton in custody. I've explained the precautions to Barrett. Gloves, surgical masks, limited contact, and she assures me they'll have him within the next hour. By then, the investigator from the CDC will be here to confirm the lethargica, and this tragedy will come to a close." Mulder ran his hands through his hair. "Personally, Scully, I don't think the CDC is going to make this case any clearer. You can follow the lethargica angle as far as it's going to go. In the meantime, I'm going to find out more about our John Doe." "Mulder, we've already gone through his chart a half-dozen times. Until we've got a body and an autopsy, there isn't much more we can discover about his death." Mulder headed toward the door. "I'm not interested in how he died, Scully. I want to know how he ended up in a medical chart in the first place." The ambulance seemed to float through 3 lanes of late New York rush hour as paramedic Luke Canton navigated between the moving bumpers with an expert's grace. Mulder felt his seatbelt tighten as Canton punched the brake and the ambulance suddenly veered to the right. Mulder watched the guardrail grow closer as they rolled to a stop in the breakdown lane. Mulder saw a glimmer of broken glass a dozen yards ahead, and the twisted remains of a rear bumper in the grass just on the other side of the railing. Other than the bumper and the glass, there were no visible signs of the accident. Looks like it's been cleaned up pretty well. Should have seen it right after the accident. The whole drive was cluttered with metal and glass. All three of these lanes were closed. The cars looked like crumpled socks. You couldn't even tell the front few apart. Mulder opened his door and stepped down onto the asphalt. Canton came around the front of the ambulance and pointed to the area directly ahead of them. The accident scene started here, with the last car up against the railing just ahead. A few more were piled together in the center of the highway. Then the bulk of the accident was about 30 yards up. The lead car, a BMW Roadster, was upside down and crumpled pretty flat right in the center of the road. Mulder slowly walked forward, his eyes moving back and forth across the pavement. Was it possible to determine what caused the lead car to spin out? Canton nodded as they continued forward down the breakdown lane. According to a witness from 5 cars back, a white van was careening wildly back and forth between lanes just ahead of the BMW. The back doors of the van popped open, and the driver of the BMW panicked. She bounced off the guardrail, then flipped over. The next car, a Volvo, hit her head-on at 65 miles per hour. Then the others just piled on. They reached the spot Canton had described as the rough area where the first car had spun out. Mulder turned to the guardrail and saw a huge, jagged tear in the heavy horizontal iron bars. 2 dark tire tracks led up to the tear, and Mulder could imagine the driver's frantic efforts to stop the BMW. Did the lead driver get a good look at the van? Maybe, Canton sighed, but she was decapitated by the front axle of the Volvo. Like I said, the only good witness was 5 cars back. All the police know was that the van was white, some sort of American model, and the back doors were open. There's an APB out on it now, but there are a lot of vans like that in this city. And the John Doe? Mulder asked. He was unconscious somewhere up here? Canton walked a few more paces, then pointed to a spot in the breakdown lane. The spot was only 10 yards ahead of where the lead car had gone out of control, roughly where the van had been weaving back and forth, with the back doors hanging open. Mulder knelt down, looking at the pavement. Mulder moved his eyes along the ground, imagining the body sprawled out. Mulder felt the pavement rumble beneath his knees as a heavy jeep roared by in the closest lane. There was a clattering sound, and Mulder watched a styrofoam cup bounce toward the guardrail. His thoughts solidified as the cup disappeared down the grassy slope on the other side. He rose and walked to the edge of the breakdown lane. He moved slowly along the guardrail and paused at a spot a few feet away from where Canton was standing. There was a small dent in the guardrail just above knee level. Mulder bent down and peered at the dent. Then he looked back toward the highway. Mr. Canton, how fast did you say the lead car was moving? Probably around 65 miles an hour. That's my best estimate from the damage. And the van was traveling at around the same speed when its back doors popped open? That's right. Mulder nodded. The positioning of the dent seemed about right. If the John Doe's body had fallen out of the back of the van, hit the pavement, rolled into the guardrail, then bounced back a few yards into the breakdown lane, it would have landed right where Canton was standing. Mulder could hear the question Scully would ask the minute he told her his theory. How could a man fall out of a van moving at 65 miles per hour, dent a guardrail, and receive no external injuries? The John Doe was linked to Perry Stanton, and Perry Stanton had performed amazing, inhuman physical feats. Wasn't it possible that the John Doe had been similarly invulnerable? Mulder reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sterile plastic evidence bag and a small horsehair brush. He leaned close to the dent in the railing and began to collect brush samples. "What are you doing over there?" Canton asked him, watching him. "I said we found the John Doe over here." "I don't think the body started there, Mr. Canton. I think that was just Mr. Doe's final resting place. It's the journey between that interests me." Mulder was about to drop to the ground and get samples from the pavement when his brush caught on a small groove in the railing. When he pulled the brush free, he noticed a few tiny strips of white cloth caught in the fine horse hairs. He held the brush close to his eyes and saw flakes of some sort of red powder clinging to the underside of the strips. The powder had a strong, moldy scent. He took a bag out of his pocket and put the strips inside. Then he crossed back to Canton. Canton was looking at him strangely. "Why is the FBI so interested in this John Doe anyway? Was he some sort of serial killer?" "As far as we know," Mulder said, kneeling down to take more samples from the pavement, "he didn't do anything but die. Problem was, his skin didn't die with him." 40 minutes later, Mulder entered the infectious disease ward at New York Hospital. Scully was arguing with a quarantined Dr. Bernstein. Mulder led her out into the hallway. "Scully, I'd like you to take a look at something. Tell me if you have any idea what it is." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small bag containing the cloth strips and the red powder. Scully took the bag from him and carefully opened the seal. She looked inside, then scrunched up the skin above her nose. Then she pressed her gloved fingers together against the sides of the bag, getting a sense of the powder's texture. "Actually, I think I have seen something like this before. From the scent and grain, I think the powder might be an antibacterial agent of some sort. The strips of cloth look like they could have come from a bandage. Where did you get this?" "The accident scene where the John Doe's body was found." "Before you jump to any conclusions, let me show this to Dr. Bernstein. He's a surgeon. He'll have a better idea what this is." They re-entered the private care room. Dr. Bernstein was lying on his back, his hands behind his head. "Back so soon? Have I been paroled?" Scully handed him the plastic bag. "Actually, we're just here to ask for your opinion. Do you recognize this red substance?" Bernstein sat up, shaking the bag in front of his eyes. He opened a corner of the seal and took a small breath. Then he nodded. "The dust. Oh, that's what we call it. It's an antibacterial compound used during massive skin transplantations. We're talking about patients with at least 50% burns, often more. It's fairly cutting edge, very powerful, very expensive. The patent was only recently approved by the FDA." Mulder cleared his throat. "Dr. Bernstein, how common is this dust?" "Not common at all," Bernstein said, handing the bag back to Scully. "I don't think it's used in any of the local hospitals. If you want more information, I suggest you contact the company that developed and markets it, Fibrol International. It's a biotech that specializes in burn transplantation materials. I'm pretty sure their headquarters is nearby." Mulder watched as Scully thanked Bernstein. Then he followed her back out into the hallway. "Scully, this is too much of a coincidence." "Well, a specialized transplant powder found at the scene where the John Doe was picked up. It might mean that the John Doe himself was a transplant recipient, and then his skin was harvested, passing along strange, unexplainable symptoms to Perry Stanton. The red powder, the dust, might be the key to everything. We need to talk to the people at Fibrol International, find out if we can trace—" Mulder was interrupted by a high-pitched ring. Scully had her cellular phone out before the noise had finished echoing through Mulder's ears. "Detective Barrett," Scully mouthed. Her face changed as she listened to the tinny voice in her ear. When she hung up the phone, her eyes were bright and animated. "It's Stanton. An eyewitness saw him entering a subway terminal in Brooklyn Heights. Barrett wants to know if we want to be in on the arrest." Mulder was already moving toward the elevators. After stopping at the FBI's East Side Armory for a pair of stun guns, Mulder and Scully found themselves joining Detective Barrett in the subway tunnels under Brooklyn. Officers Leary and Kenyon had already followed Stanton into the darkness. At the junction of the tunnel with a service shaft, they came across the unconscious body of Leary. Scully remained behind with the downed man. Mulder and Barrett renewed the chase. Mulder's chest burned as the adrenaline pumped through his body. He could hear Barrett's heavy gasps from a few feet behind his right shoulder. Every few seconds a curse echoed into his ears as she struggled to keep up. The tunnel seemed to be narrowing as they neared the surface. Mulder slowed his pace, motioning for Barrett to keep quiet. They were close to the dead end, and that meant Perry Stanton and the other officer had to be nearby. The tunnel took a sharp right, and suddenly Mulder found himself in the entrance to a small, rectangular corridor. Mulder moved the flashlight along the walls and saw wires and steel cables running in parallel twists across the limestone. Every few feet, he made out dark little alcoves dug directly into the walls. Mulder raised his stun gun and slowly advanced into the corridor. His neck tingled as he swung the flashlight back and forth, trying to illuminate as much area as possible. Despite his efforts, he was surrounded by black air. After a few feet, he realized the danger he was in. Stanton could hit him from either side, and he'd never see him coming. He was about to turn back toward Barrett when his right foot touched something soft. He quickly aimed the flashlight toward the ground. He saw wisps of blue, marred by spots of seeping red. Then the orange beam touched the shiny curves of a police badge. He was about to call for Barrett when there was a sudden motion from his right. He turned just as the shape hit him right below the shoulder. His stun gun went off, sparks flying through the darkness as the twin metal contacts glanced off a limestone wall. Mulder's shoulder hit the ground and the air was knocked out of him. His hands opened and the flashlight and stun gun clattered away. The flashlight beam twirled through the blackness, and he caught sight of Perry Stanton's face rearing up above him, a look of anguish in his blue eyes. Then he saw Stanton's hands, clenched into wiry fists, rising above his head. Stanton leapt toward him, and Mulder shouted, raising his arms, and suddenly there was a high-pitched buzzing. Stanton froze mid-step, his eyes widening, his mouth curling open. Convulsions rocked his body, his muscles twisting into strange knots beneath his skin. He arched backward, his knees giving out. He collapsed to the ground a few feet away, his arms and legs twitching. Then he went still. Mulder crawled to his knees as Scully entered the corridor, the stun gun hanging loosely from her right hand. Barrett rushed out from behind her, her revolver uselessly pointed at Stanton's prone body. "I couldn't get a clear shot. Christ, he came at you so fast!" Scully hurried to Mulder's side. She was out of breath, sweat dripping into her eyes. "Are you okay?" "Leary regained consciousness shortly after we separated. I decided he could wait for the paramedics on his own." "Good timing, Scully. An even better aim." Scully smiled. "Actually, I didn't aim. I just fired. You got lucky and saved yourself a nasty hangover." Mulder gestured toward the cop lying in the middle of the corridor. "Officer Kenyon wasn't so lucky." Scully followed her flashlight to the man and checked his pulse. Then she pushed his shoulder, turning him onto his side. She looked up and Mulder saw the stricken look on her face. He glanced at the officer and realized the man's head was facing the wrong direction. Stanton had twisted his neck 180 degrees, snapping his spinal column. Barrett saw the dead officer and noisily reholstered her gun. "The damn animal! I don't care how sick he is, I'm going to make sure he spends the rest of his life in a cell!" Mulder didn't respond to Barrett's angry comment. No matter how tragic the situation, he didn't believe Stanton was responsible. He thought about the anguished look in the professor's eyes and the strange convulsions that had racked his body. It had almost seemed as if Stanton's muscles had been fighting his skin. Mulder rose slowly and found his flashlight along the nearby wall. Then he trained the light on the downed professor. Stanton was lying on his back, his arms and legs twisted unnaturally at his sides. His eyes were wide open, his lips curled back. Mulder took a tentative step forward. Something wasn't right. "Scully," he said, focusing the flashlight on Stanton's still chest. "I don't think he's breathing." Scully stepped away from the dead officer. "He's just stunned, Mulder. The voltage running through the taser contacts wasn't anywhere near enough to kill him." Just the same, she moved to the little man's side and dropped to her knees. She carefully leaned forward, holding her ear above his mouth. She drew away, staring. She tilted Stanton's head back, searching his mouth and throat for obstructions. Then she moved both hands over his chest and started vigorous CPR. Finally, Scully stopped, leaning back from the body. Her red hair was damp with effort. "He's gone, Mulder. I don't understand. He didn't have a heart condition. He was strong enough to kill an officer. How could a stun gun have done this to him?" Mulder didn't have an answer. As voices drifted into the corridor from out in the tunnel, a strange thought struck him. An officer had fired a total of 3 shots at Stanton and hadn't slowed him down. Scully had hit him once with the electric stun gun, and he had died. Similarly, the John Doe had quite possibly fallen out of a moving van at 70 miles per hour and had not received a scratch. Then 2 interns had shocked him with a defibrillator, and he had died on the stretcher. "Scully," he started, but then stopped himself as a team of paramedics rushed a portable stretcher into the corridor, followed by a handful of uniformed officers. Mulder and Scully stepped out of the way as more paramedics moved into the corridor and lifted Stanton onto another stretcher. Scully watched with determined eyes. "I'm going to get to the bottom of this, Mulder. I'm going to perform the autopsy myself and find out what really killed him." The digitized view screen flickered, then changed to a dull green color. Scully leaned back in the leather office chair, her hands stretched out in front of her. A radiology tech in a white lab coat hovered over her shoulder. "Just another few seconds." The MRI scan was not normal autopsy procedure, but Scully had decided to take every extra measure possible to understand what had happened to Perry Stanton. "Here we go," the tech coughed, pointing at the screen. The printer began to hum just as the screen flickered again, and suddenly the dull green display was replaced by a shifting sea of gray. The gray conformed roughly to the shape of a human skull, representing a vertical cross-section taken through the direct center of Perry Stanton's brain. It took Scully less than a second to realize that all of her previous assumptions had to be reevaluated. Even without the autopsy, she knew for a fact that Stanton had not died from anything related to the encephalitis virus. "This can't be right." The tech glanced at the screen, then turned to the printer and pulled out a stack of pages. The pages showed the same image, multiplied 4 times at slightly different angles. "This is the sequence you ordered. The machine's been in use all morning and nobody's had a complaint." Scully took the pictures from him, looking them over. She had never seen anything like it before. There was no edema, none of the cerebral swelling she would have expected from encephalitis lethargica, but Stanton's brain was anything but normal. She reached forward with a finger and traced a large, dark, gray spot near the center of the picture. It was the hypothalamus, the gland that regulated the nervous system, but it was enormous, nearly 3 times as large as normal. Surrounding the engorged gland were 6 strange, polyp-type growths arranged in a rough semicircle. In all her time spent in pathology labs, she had never seen such a manifestation. She rose quickly from the leather chair, the pictures tucked under her right arm. She wanted to get to that autopsy room as soon as possible. When Scully arrived at the hospital's lower level, she found that the CDC had already claimed Stanton's body. But she wasn't prepared to give up. Armed with the MRI prints, she went to find Mulder. 10 minutes later, Scully and Mulder were huddled together in the corner of a cramped administrative office located 1 floor above the pathology ward. The computer whirred as the inboard modem connected the 2 agents to the nationwide medical database located in Washington, D.C. "This search should cover any MRIs, CAT scans, or skull x-rays with similar manifestations," Scully said. "The Medline system is linked to every hospital in the country and many throughout the world. If there's an associated syndrome, we'll surely find something." She paused as the screen began to change. Suddenly her eyes widened. Mulder read the notice at the top of the file that had suddenly appeared. 1 match. New York Hospital, 1984. Scully immediately realized the significance of the notice. As she skimmed the first paragraph of the file, her shock grew. The MRI scan had matched to a pair of CAT scans taken on 2 inmates of Rikers Island in New York shortly before their deaths. Both inmates had been part of some sort of volunteer experimental study performed in the early 80s under the auspices of a fledgling biotech company located just outside Manhattan. "Fibrol International," Mulder stated, his voice characteristically calm. "The same company that manufactures the red powder I found at the accident scene." Scully scrolled farther down the file and found the 2 CAT scans that had heralded the match. In both images, she saw the same unmistakable pattern of polyps surrounding an enlarged hypothalamus. At the bottom of the file, she found a link to an attached file. She hit the link, and the CAT scans were replaced by a single page of official-looking text. "It's a prosecutory assessment," she said, reading the heading. "There was a criminal investigation into the man behind the experimentation, Fibrol's founder and CEO, Emil Paladin. But it looks like it never came to trial. According to this, the experiment had been conducted with full permission from the inmates in exchange for a reduced sentence. There's no explanation of the cause of death, just that it was accidental." "Look at this," Mulder said, tapping a lower paragraph in the assessment. Skin transplantation, Scully. The experiment had to do with a radical new method of skin transplantation. The red powder, it's the link, and fibrol is the common denominator. We've got to find this Emil Paladin. This happened more than 10 years ago, Scully responded, and Perry Stanton wasn't part of any radical experiment. Not directly, but the John Doe might have been, and Stanton's wearing his skin. At the headquarters of Fibril International, Scully and Mulder were shown through an impressive array of security features to the offices of Julian Kyle, the firm's director of research. They had been hoping to find Emil Paladin still at the helm of the company, but to their surprise, they had discovered in the S&P reports that Fibril's founder and CEO had died in an accident overseas shortly after the experiment involving the Rikers Island prisoners. Their guide stopped in front of a glass door, placing his palm against an infrared panel. After 2 clicks, the door slid open, and he gestured for the 2 agents to step inside. Dr. Kyle will answer all your questions from here on out. I hope you enjoy your visit. Mulder and Scully thanked him, and together they stepped into Julian Kyle's office. There was a glass desk at one end of the airy room, covered with fancy computer equipment and neat little stacks of CD-ROMs. In front of the desk crouched a black leather love seat. Julian Kyle gestured them into the room. He was built like a fire hydrant, with solid shoulders, stumpy legs, and a cubed-shaped head. 65, Mulder guessed, but it was difficult to be sure. Mulder lowered himself next to Scully onto the leather 2-seater as Kyle took a seat behind the desk. "Welcome to my humble office." "Looks like business is good," Scully commented, taking in the sleek surroundings. "Literally," Kyle beamed. "Our new product line is helping thousands of people survive transplants that would have seemed pointless just a few years ago. We've got new salve bandages, a whole new stock of microscalpels, and innovative new dry chemical wrap, just to mention a few of our recent breakthroughs." "Actually," Scully interrupted, "it's your company's past that interests us at the moment. Specifically, an episode in 1984 involving 2 prisoners at Rikers Island." Kyle raised his gray eyebrows. "It's been a long time since anyone has asked about that. It's something we've put way behind us ever since Emil's death." "I'm afraid I don't have much to tell you. Emil Paladin was a very private, controlling man. The experiment was entirely under his control, conducted in his own private clinic 100 miles upstate. It had something to do with a new transplant procedure, but beyond that, I don't know any of the details." Kyle spread his hands out against the desk, continuing in a casual voice. "After the criminal charges were dropped, Paladin announced the experimental procedure an unsalvageable failure and refocused the company toward the development of assistance products. Barely 6 months later, he died, but Fibril continued to grow in the new direction." Mulder shifted against the leather couch. Kyle had told them exactly what they already knew from the S&P reports. Scully cleared her throat, getting straight to the point. "Dr. Kyle, we have reason to believe that an individual died this morning from complications similar to those that killed the 2 prisoners. Do you have any idea how that might be possible?" Kyle stared at her in shock. "Not at all. As I said, Paladin was the only one who knew anything about the experiment, and he died almost 15 years ago. I can't imagine how anything so recent could be connected." Scully cocked her head. "We read that Paladin died in some sort of accident overseas." Kyle nodded. "A hiking accident in Thailand. It was his second home ever since the Vietnam War. He had been stationed in a MASH unit, and after the incident he had wanted to take some time off in a serene, comfortable place. He had a home outside a little fishing village called Al Kut, 200 miles east of Bangkok. He died while climbing in the mountains around his home." "And after his death," Scully interrupted, "who inherited control of the company? Did he leave behind any family?" "A brother, Andrew Paladin. But although Andrew is the major stockholder, he doesn't have any involvement with the company. You see, Andrew's what you'd call a recluse. He served in the Vietnam War about the same time as his brother. After the war, he settled in Thailand, and he hasn't left the country since." "Is there some way we can get in touch with him?" Scully asked. Kyle shrugged. "Not that I know of. He employed a lawyer in Bangkok around the time of his brother's death, but we haven't heard from him in more than 10 years. But I doubt he'd be useful, even if you found him. As I said, Paladin was extremely independent. He kept his work private." Mulder leaned close to the desk, abruptly changing tack. "Dr. Kyle, tell us about the dust." For the first time in the short interview, Kyle's calm seemed to break. The dust? I'm amazed you've even heard of it. We only received the patent last year. It's a very recent development. It had nothing at all to do with Emil Paladin's work." Mulder glanced at Scully. He had not mentioned any connection to Paladin's experiment. Kyle had made the jump himself. Scully followed Mulder's lead. "Dr. Kyle, yesterday morning we found a sample of your powder in a breakdown lane on the FDR drive." "That's certainly strange. None of the New York hospitals is using the dust yet. Still, I guess it could have come from a shipment between a couple of our clinics. It's something I could easily check out." Scully nodded, but Mulder wasn't about to leave it at that. "We'd also like to consider another possibility. Could the dust have been left behind by a recent transplant patient?" Kyle laughed curtly. "That's extremely unlikely. In fact, I'd say it's damn near impossible. The dust is only used on radical transplant patients. These are not patients who get up and walk around. They can't even survive transport in ambulances. There's no way such a patient would be found out of a hospital, not even for a moment." Mulder was surprised by Kyle's adamant tone. "Well, perhaps you could show us some data on the powder to help us understand? Maybe a list of the types of patients you've used it on." "I'm sorry," Kyle interrupted, rising from his chair, "but I really need to speak to the board before I can get to any of our records. I don't mean to be difficult, but this is a very competitive time for our company. I need to go through the proper channels before I release any proprietary information." Kyle showed the two agents to the door. "I'm sorry I couldn't be more helpful." Kyle put his palm against the plate next to the door. "I'll be in touch if I find any more information for you." It wasn't until they were back in the privacy of their rental Chevrolet that Mulder finally told Scully what he was thinking. "Kyle knows something. We need to keep digging." Scully was momentarily silent, her hands on the dashboard in front of her. Finally, she shrugged. "It won't be easy. Emil Paladin died nearly 15 years ago. According to Kyle, he took the secrets of his experiment with him. And what about the red powder, and the link to the John Doe?" "I thought Kyle was pretty convincing. It could have fallen out of a shipment of medical supplies. The link with the John Doe is still unproven." Mulder turned the ignition and the car kicked to life. Fibrils involved, the MRI pictures don't lie. Stanton was another victim of Emil Paladin's transplantation experiment, and if Kyle can't tell us how that's possible, then we've got to find someone who can. He could see that Scully was thinking along the same lines. Andrew Paladin, the recluse brother. He might have been the last person to speak to Emil Paladin before he died. Mulder nodded, glancing at the box-like complex shrinking rapidly in the Chevy's rearview mirror. They could spend weeks, even months, trying to crack through Fibrol's nondescript facade, but Mulder had a strong feeling that the answers they were looking for lay all the way on the other side of the world. Left alone in his windowless office, Julian Kyle reached beneath his desk and hit a small button located just above his knees. A few seconds later, the door to his office slid open. He watched as the tall young man with slicked-back sable hair slid into the room and tossed himself onto the couch, his long legs hooked nonchalantly over one of the armrests. "Having a bad day, Uncle Julian?" Kyle grimaced as the boy's voice trickled into his ears. He had watched the child grow up, but thankfully there was no physical relationship between them. Kyle considered himself a religious, moral man. The boy was something altogether different. Warped. Dangerous. All of his father's sins, without any of his father's virtues. "We have a problem," Kyle responded, keeping the conversation as short as possible. "The situation has not yet been contained. Those two FBI agents aren't going to be easily dissuaded. They can't be allowed to get any closer." "You worry too much," the boy interrupted, running a hand through his dark hair. "They don't even have a body to work with. As long as we remain a step ahead of them, They'll have nothing but guesses. Kyle rubbed his square jaw. At this stage, even guesses can be dangerous. The boy laced his fingers together, then shrugged. As always, I eagerly await your orders. Kyle took a deep breath, slowly reaching for his phone. It's not my orders you follow, Quo Tien. Don't you ever forget that. For both our sakes. 18 hours later, the rain was coming down in wide gray sheets as Mulder navigated a rented four-wheel drive Jeep down a road rapidly changing from dirt to mud. Scully had a U.S. Army surplus map open in her lap, and she was struggling to match the surroundings with 20-year-old military notations. The town shouldn't be much farther, Scully commented. I think the Gulf of Thailand is directly down that slope, and that outcropping to the right, that leads straight up into the mountains. Si Dum Khao, the Black Hills. According to the map, the Si Dum Range encompasses an area of nearly 200 square miles, mostly unlivable and uncharted. Recluse heaven, Mulder said. Hide out in a cave somewhere, eat a few indigenous animals for supper, have your recluse buddies over on the weekends to watch the mudslides. Mulder! The Jeep tipped perilously forward as the dirt road suddenly disappeared in a descending tangle of thick vegetation and loose rocks. Mulder yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, fighting to keep the headlights facing forward as the Jeep tumbled down the steep embankment. Mulder slammed his foot against the brake. The Jeep fishtailed to the left, then skidded to a complete stop. Eyes wild, Mulder looked up and saw that they were parked on the edge of a cobblestone road, facing a long, flat valley bordered on three sides by the rising forest. The Gulf of Thailand was no more than 300 yards to the left. Mulder could make out a long wooden dock 50 yards away, surrounded by brightly colored Chinese-style junks and smaller motorized fishing boats. I think we've found Al-Kut, Scully commented, breathing hard. This looks like the spot, Scully said a few hours later, huddled next to Mulder beneath the skimpy overhang of a tired-looking palm tree. According to the Army's records, this clinic was built over the original location of Emil Paladin's MASH unit. The clinic was low and rectangular, stretching along the muddy road for about 20 yards. There were a half-dozen crude windows cut into the cinder block facade, covered in thick sheets of transparent plastic. Above the nondescript main entrance was a carved, grinning Buddha, sunk directly into the wall, beneath two rows of Thai lettering. According to the white-haired old man who ran the small hotel where Mulder and Scully had deposited their things, Buddhist monks had been running the clinic for nearly 10 years. Mulder, check out the building across the street. Isn't that a church? Mulder turned to look at the small two-story structure that faced the clinic. The building was painted white, with a single conic steeple. The place looked like it had been shut down a long time ago, and the front doors covered in the same transparent plastic as the clinic's windows. It doesn't look like they're doing a very brisk business. Thailand is the only country in Southeast Asia never to have been a European colony, Scully commented. Christianity never gained a foothold here. Mulder turned away from the church and gestured toward an object just in front of the clinic. It was a small wooden dollhouse set on top of a cylindrical post. The miniature house had obviously been constructed with great care. Someone had recently placed mounds of fresh garlands around the base of the house, and two long sticks of incense leaked smoke past the tiny glass windows. Mulder started forward toward the little house and the entrance to the clinic. It's a spirit house. They serve as the homes of the resident Phais, spirits of the particular building nearby. You seem to know a lot about the Thai religion, Mulder. Mulder smiled as they reached the door to the clinic. I have an enormous respect for the Thai, always have. Their spirituality is extremely individualistic. In fact, the word Thai means free. Their beliefs aren't a matter of doctrine, but of day-to-day observation. There's something to be said for a culture that's remained independent, without even a single civil war, for over 800 years. The door came open, and Mulder felt cool air touch his wet cheeks. He ushered Scully out of the rain and shut the door behind them. They were standing at the edge of a wide rectangular hall with plaster walls and a cement floor. More than a dozen litters were set up along the two side walls, complete with ivy racks, medical carts, and the odd EKG machine. The litters were modern, with chrome frames, steel wheels, and thick hospital bedding. At least half the litters were occupied. Buddhist monks in orange robes moved among the patients, followed by nurses in white Red Cross uniforms. Mulder noticed that the monks were wearing latex gloves, and many had stethoscopes around their necks. All things considered, the place was sparser than a Western clinic, but seemed modern and efficient. Scully touched Mulder's shoulder, pointing toward one of the litters. Two monks hovered over the chrome rail, watching as a tall, blonde, Caucasian woman leaned close to the patient's chest. Mulder noticed that her jacket was different than the ones worn by the Red Cross nurses. Beneath the jacket, the woman was wearing light blue surgical scrubs. "Looks like she's in charge," Scully said. "That's an MD's jacket. And the way she's wearing her stethoscope, she's trained in the U.S., at least through her internship." As Mulder and Scully approached the litter, the woman stepped back, letting the two monks have a better look at what she had just done. The patient was mid-40s, conscious, with his shirt tied around his waist. A thin line of fresh sutures ran from his upper abdomen to just below his collarbone. "We'll put him on antibiotics for 3 weeks," the woman said to the monks. "He should be as good as new, unless he gets in the way of another swordfish hook." The monks nodded vigorously, and the woman turned, noticing the two agents for the first time. "You two look like you're from out of town. I'm Dr. Leanna Fielding. Is there something I can help you with?" Mulder slid his ID out of his pants pocket. "I'm Fox Mulder. This is my partner, Dana Scully. We're U.S. federal agents, and we were hoping you could spare a moment of your time. Are you a full-time resident of Alcut, Dr. Fielding?" Fielding pulled off her latex gloves and tossed them toward a plastic waste bin. "Actually, I'm attached to the local division of the Red Cross. I make a tour of all the towns and villages in the area, teaching and assisting as much as I can. U.S. federal agents. You're rather far from home, aren't you?" Scully had stepped next to the litter and was surveying the stitches. "From your cross-stitching, Dr. Fielding, my guess is you trained in the States. Is that right?" "Chicago. Are you a doctor?" Scully nodded. "Forensic pathology. But I'm not here in that capacity." "We're investigating a case that goes back 15 years, Mulder interrupted. "We're interested in finding two men connected to the MASH unit that used to be located on this spot, Emil and Andrew Paladin." Fielding coughed, then glanced at the two monks who had both looked up at the mention of the names. "If you're federal agents, I'm sure you must know that Emil Paladin died a long time ago." Mulder's instincts kicked in as he watched the two monks whispering to one another. Something about Emil Paladin's name had struck a nerve. Leanna Fielding made an attempt at explanation. "Emil Paladin is part of this town's history, Agent Mulder. His MASH unit was many of the townspeople's first real contact with the outside world. As you probably know, the Thai have an extremely creative way of thinking. Things that are different inspire stories, legends, and fear. And from what I understand, Emil Paladin was indeed different." Mulder felt his muscles tense. "How do you mean?" "I'm not really the person you should be talking to. I'm not a native of this town, and I have no personal knowledge of either of the Paladins. But there is someone who might be able to help you. Alan Trowbridge, one of the clinic's founders." "Did Trowbridge know Emil Paladin?" "Well, Alan served as an orderly with the MASH unit during the war. He decided to settle in Alcut after the war ended. He helped set up this clinic, and was responsible for getting the Red Cross to send much of the equipment. He's very well respected in the community." "Is he here at the clinic?" Mulder asked, his interest growing. "Today is his day off. You can probably find him at home. I'll give you directions. A friendly warning, though. From what I've heard about Emil Paladin and his MASH unit, you aren't going to be making many friends bringing up that past. Some things are better left alone." Mulder's face caught fire from the inside, followed by a shrill ringing deep in his ears. He quickly reached for his drink, but his eyes were watering so much he couldn't find the glass. He opened his mouth to beg for help, but all he could manage was a fierce, choking sound. His attempts at communication were met by a gale of laughter from the other side of the low wooden table. Alan Trowbridge slammed his beefy palms together, a huge smile on his lips. Like I said, sometimes is an acquired taste. Mulder finally found his glass of Thai beer, letting the harsh bubbles chase the fire away. You know, assaulting FBI agents is a federal crime. What did you say was in this concoction? Before Trowbridge could answer, his wife sidled up next to him, bowing softly as she took her seat at the low pine table. Her appearance was a striking contrast to her husband. Trowbridge was a huge man, over 6 feet tall, and at least 220 pounds. Rena Trowbridge, on the other hand, was a tiny woman. First, Rena said, we start with raw papaya. Then we add lime juice, a handful of chilies, dried shrimp, and tiny salted land crabs. I apologize for the lack of warning. My husband is a sadist. Mulder laughed. In truth, Alan Trowbridge seemed to be a genuinely amiable man. Despite Dr. Fielding's warnings, Trowbridge had not seemed upset by Mulder and Scully's line of questions about Emil Paladin and the MASH unit. Instead of displaying any anger, he had immediately demanded that the two agents join him for lunch. His wife had happily added 2 settings to the table. You've come a long way to ask questions about ancient history, Trowbridge said. Emil and Andrew Paladin are a part of this village's past, but certainly not part of its present. I haven't spoken either of those names in a long, long time. I don't know anything about Andrew Paladin's whereabouts. I've heard rumors that he lives up in the mountains, but I haven't seen him since the war, so I'm not sure how I can help you. But you did serve under Emil Paladin in the MASH unit, Scully asked. Dr. Fielding led us to believe that Paladin and his unit were not something Alcut was very fond of remembering. Trowbridge nodded, his smile weakening slightly. Well, it was a time of war, and Emil Paladin was an intimidating, obsessive man. He ran the MASH unit like it was his private fiefdom. And to the villagers who weren't used to the effects of modern warfare, sometimes the place seemed like a hell on earth. And I guess that made Emil Paladin into some sort of devil. Mulder paused. What exactly do you mean? Trowbridge spread his hands against the table, his eyes shifting downward for a brief second. Our MASH unit specialized in napalm injuries, Agent Mulder. They sent us the absolute worst of the worst. Men with burns over 50% of their skin. A steady stream of horribly scorched soldiers, most without faces. Men who should have died on the battlefield, but had somehow survived. Emil Paladin was their doctor, Trowbridge continued, and they were his obsession. He spent his days and nights surrounded by those tortured souls. He hardly spoke to anyone. Scully leaned forward. Were you aware of what he was working on? Trowbridge took a deep breath, his face slightly paled. Skin. He was searching for the perfect synthetic skin. Something that could trick the body's defenses, that would be accepted by the immune system, that could repair the damage from the napalm. He would spend weeks locked in his research laboratory, working on his skin. By the end, the only one he allowed inside with him was his son. Mulder turned toward Trowbridge, wondering if he had misheard. Emil Paladin had a son. Julian Kyle had not mentioned anything about a son, nor had there been anything in the military or FBI files on Emil Paladin about progeny. Paladin had a child? Scully asked. Trowbridge looked toward his wife, who instantly met his gaze. The fear was plainly written across her face. But Trowbridge shook his head, turning back to the agents. The boy's name was Kuo Tien. He was born to a prostitute who lived near the MASH unit. She died during childbirth, and Paladin took the child as his own. He raised the boy among his burned, tortured patients. As you can guess, the boy did not turn out well. He shook his head as if chasing the memories away. As I said, that's all ancient history. The war ended, the MASH unit closed up shop, Emil Paladin and his son moved out of Alcut, and a few years later he died, End of story, Trowbridge seemed to want to add. But something in his eyes told Mulder the story was actually far from over. A hiking accident, that's what we were told. And that's what's on the death certificate, Trowbridge said, speaking quietly. He fell into a deep ravine while hiking in the mountains. During the war, he had often taken trips up Sea-Dum Cow. He was an avid student of Thai mythology, and there are many ancient ruins in those mountains. But the terrain can be quite treacherous. Paladin broke his neck in a canyon near the range's peak. His body was greatly damaged by the fall and picked clean by local wildlife. Rena Trowbridge suddenly cleared her throat, drawing the attention away from her husband. My husband has not told you the entire story. My husband is afraid. We are both afraid. Trowbridge whispered something in Thai to his wife. She lowered her eyes. Mulder felt Scully's hand on his arm, but he couldn't let things lie. Mr. Trowbridge, if you're in some kind of danger... It's nothing, Trowbridge loudly interrupted, not meeting Mulder's eyes. An old wives' tale, a foolish myth, a farmer's superstition, rumors... They are not rumors, Rena Trowbridge declared. Gin Kyong Pyu is not a rumor. It's a local legend, Trowbridge finally explained, dating back many centuries. Gin Kong Pyu means, literally, the skin eater. It's the name of a mythical creature that supposedly lives in a cave at the base of the Sea-Dum Range. The skin eater? Scully repeated. I know how foolish it sounds, Trowbridge responded, facing her. But as the story goes, around 300 years ago, bodies began to crop up around the town, minus their skin. Usually vagrants, sometimes farm animals, sometimes missing children. And always the corpses were found in the same state, completely skinned. A local cult grew up around the mysterious deaths, and a small temple was even erected out near the edge of town. Sacrifices were made, and about a century ago the corpses stopped appearing. According to the myth, Gin Kong Pyu was sated. The creature went into an indefinite hibernation in his cave. Rena lowered herself to her husband's side, but his hibernation was interrupted. 25 years ago, around the same time the MASH unit opened its doors, the skinned bodies began appearing again. First farm animals, then a pair of brothers lost on a hunting expedition, then more and more villagers. Every week it seemed there was another skinned corpse found near the town, and of course everyone knew it was because of the MASH unit. Mulder did not need to see Scully's expression to know what she was thinking, but he was not so quick to dismiss the woman's story. And why was that, Mrs. Trowbridge? Emil Paladin had awakened the skin eater, either through his hikes in the mountains or because of the thousands of horribly tormented soldiers he brought to Alkut. He had awakened Gin Kong Pyu after so many years, and the creature was hungry. And now, Scully asked, trying to keep the skepticism out of her voice, are there still skinless corpses appearing around town? Rena Trowbridge shook her head. Emil Paladin was their last victim. After his death, the creature returned to his hibernation. Scully touched Mulder's shoulder as she rose to her feet. Thank you both for your lunch and for your time. I'm sorry we can't stay any longer, but we need to continue our search for Andrew Paladin. Trowbridge nodded. I'm sorry I can't help you there. You might try speaking to David Quo. He's the only lawyer in town, and he probably had some connection to the Paladins at the time of Emil's death. His office is connected to the town hall, a small circular building a block past the clinic. Mulder shook Trowbridge's hand and bowed to his wife, thanking her for the meal. He waited until he and Scully had reached the door before letting his thoughts form into a question. You mentioned a temple built to placate Gin Kong Pyu. Does it still exist? Trowbridge seemed surprised by Mulder's interest. At the very edge of town, a stone building with a domed roof. It is run by a cadre of monks in dark red robes, the cult of Gin Kong Pyu. They keep the temple in order in case of his reawakening, Rena Trowbridge finished. Kuo Tien watched from across the street until the two agents turned the corner, heading toward the center of town. Then he quietly approached the traditional wooden house. His long, thin body was draped in a flowing black smock. There was a heavy burlap bag hanging from the belt around his waist, and a dark rucksack slung over his left shoulder. When he arrived at the front steps leading up to the house, he reached into an inner pocket in his smock and withdrew a shiny steel straight razor with a molded plastic handle. The blade was 3¼ inches long, the handle specially designed to conform to Tien's fingers. A surge of hunger swept through him as he climbed the low steps, his free hand forming a gentle fist. He knocked twice on the painted wood. A few seconds later, the door swung inward. There was a brief pause. Then recognition snapped across Alan Trowbridge's face. His eyes went wide, his mouth jerked open and closed. Tien smiled. "Hello, Alan. Mind if I come inside?" "Hello? Is anyone home?" Mulder stood in the arched entrance to the stone temple, staring down a long, dark corridor with smooth, rounded walls and a packed mud floor. It had not been difficult to locate the temple at the far edge of the village. After he had dropped Scully off at the town hall, he had simply followed the main cobblestone road to its conclusion, then taken a hard right toward the forest. Mulder started forward, listening to his own voice echoing back at him from the darkness. The air was dense and cool, a stark contrast to the sweltering atmosphere outside. The walls on either side were smooth stone, polished to the point of reflection. There were wooden torches mounted every few feet along the walls, none of them lit. A few yards before total darkness, Mulder came to a second door, covered in some sort of frayed cloth. Mulder felt around the face of the material, but couldn't find anything resembling a doorknob. The cloth felt strangely warm, and Mulder wondered if there was something burning on the other side of the door. He pressed both palms flat against the thin material and gave a gentle shove. The door swung inward. A sudden wave of heat splashed against Mulder's face. As his pupils adjusted to the flickering firelight, Mulder saw that he was standing at the mouth of a circular inner chamber. There was an ancient-looking clay altar in the center of the chamber, 10 yards ahead of him. Bright flames leapt high into the air above the clay, barely contained by a red-hot steel bowl filled with flammable, pitch-black liquid. Just beyond the steel bowl, seeming to shiver in the intense heat of the flames, stood an enormous statue made of some sort of shiny black stone. "Gin Korng Pew," Mulder whispered, as his eyes rode up the face of the stone beast. The black statue had a long, ridged snout like an emaciated wolf. The lips were curled back to reveal multiple rows of razor-sharp fangs. 2 5-foot-long, curved tusks jutted out from the stone creature's bottom jaw, crisscrossing together just below its flared nostrils. "Every culture has its monsters," a voice suddenly echoed in his ear. "But they are all cut from the same soul." Mulder whirled toward the voice. He saw that the far wall of the chamber was lined with dark alcoves. As Mulder watched, a stooped figure stepped out of the center alcove. The figure was wearing a bright red monk's robe. Mulder stared at the man, stunned. The old monk noticed his expression and laughed. "Are you more afraid of the statue or of me?" Mulder cleared his throat. "You speak English?" The monk nodded. "I spent 3 years at the university in Bangkok. I was a theology major. My name is Ganon." Mulder gestured toward the statue behind the flaming altar. "And this is the skin-eater?" Ganon paused, his gaze still pinned to Mulder's face. "Nobody alive has ever seen Gin Kong Pew. This statue is based on an ancient drawing found in a cave not far from this temple. Perhaps it is the creature. Perhaps it is a fairy tale chiseled out of polished stone." Ganon made a brief motion with his hand, and a teenage boy in a similar red robe stepped out of one of the other alcoves. Mulder shifted his eyes back to the old monk. "But you believe the monster is real?" Ganon shrugged. He snapped the fingers of his right hand, and the teenager quickly crossed the room to where Mulder was standing. Without a word, the boy pulled a small glass vial out of his robe. The vial was filled with some sort of clear liquid with tiny leaves floating inside. "It is unimportant what I believe," Ganon said. "I am a lowly servant of this temple. My role is to keep that altar lit and to offer my protection to those who seek it." He nodded his head, and the emaciated boy opened the vial and poured a few droplets of the clear liquid into his palm. He approached Mulder and reached for Mulder's cheek. Mulder involuntarily drew back. "Malku will not hurt you. The balm is a spirit repellent. It is designed to protect the skin. All who journey into the mountains surrounding Alkut must wear the balm, or risk a horrible fate." Mulder raised his eyebrows as he let the boy rub the liquid into his cheeks. It had a strong scent, bitter like almonds, with a tinge of something sulphurous. "And you think I'm going to journey into the mountains?" "Again, it is unimportant what I believe." The teenager stepped back, then placed the vial in Mulder's hand. "Take. Make skin taste bad. Take." Mulder watched as the boy turned and shuffled back toward his alcove. "Is that what the creature does? Eat the skin, like its name implies?" "As the story goes," Ganon answered, moving gracefully toward the altar, "skin is the source of its immortality. Gin Kong Pew feeds on the skin of the unlucky to replenish itself. When it is asleep, it does not need to feed. Only when it is disturbed does it feel the hunger." "So the MASH unit woke the creature and sent it on a hungry rampage," Mulder said. "Somehow Emil Paladin upset the beast and the town suffered because of him. Now the creature is once again in hibernation, somewhere in the mountains." "Somewhere in Sea-Dum Cow," Ganon repeated, staring at the flames. "A vast cave called Tum Thai, the Spirit Cavern." Mulder looked at the glass vial in his hand. Then his gaze shifted to the statue of the Skin Eater. Maybe Ganon was just telling him what he had already guessed, that the answers he was looking for were in those mountains, waiting for him. 30 minutes later, Mulder found Scully sitting on the partially enclosed front steps leading up to the town hall, leafing through a manila folder. Scully finally looked up, noticing the expression on his face. "You look like you just met the boogeyman." Mulder smiled. "I think maybe I did. How was your visit with David Quo? Anything interesting?" Scully sighed. "He doesn't know anything about Andrew's whereabouts. He was Emil Paladin's lawyer, but only in name. He had very little contact with the man since the war, and almost zero contact with his brother." "So what's in the folder?" "Quo retrieved this for me from the town hall records. It's the ME's file from Emil Paladin's autopsy. And before you start telling me about your boogeyman, Emil Paladin died from a broken neck." Mulder's expression didn't change. "And what about his skin? Or lack thereof?" "Again, no great mystery. His body was mutilated by 3 different types of predators, all readily identifiable by the teeth marks. The damage was so bad, the positive ID was made from a dental match. According to the report, Andrew claimed the body, and it was cremated a few days after the autopsy." "Cremated,"
Mulder leaned back against the steps, stretching his neck side to side. Scully rolled her eyes. "Mulder, the body was cremated after the autopsy, not before. There's no mystery here." Mulder didn't respond. "It's a myth, Mulder, a fairy tale, and it has nothing to do with our case. Perry Stanton didn't have his skin eaten by some beast. Neither did Emil Paladin. I just don't think we can discount anything out of hand." "Mulder," Scully started, but she was interrupted by a frightened shout from down the street. Mulder looked up to see a pair of orange-robed monks running towards them, their faces masks of terror. They were the two monks from the clinic. "Quickly!" the larger of the two shouted. "Please! Terrible thing! Terrible thing!" He waved his arms wildly, pointing down the cobblestone street. Mulder rose quickly, following Scully down the steps. The monks nodded vigorously, then turned and rushed down the street. Mulder and Scully had to jog to keep up with them. "This sounds pretty serious," Scully shouted. "How did they know where to find us?" "It's a small town, and we're pretty hard to miss." The monks turned an abrupt corner, winding out of the center of town. With a start, Mulder realized the direction they were heading. "Scully, don't the Trowbridges live down the next street?" Both agents hurried their pace, catching up to the monks. As they approached the Trowbridges' home, Mulder saw that a small crowd of people had gathered on the front lawn. Mulder made out the distinct sound of weeping. Then he saw Gannon at the edge of the crowd, and their eyes met. Gannon nodded, his mouth moving, the words disappearing in the gray rain. Mulder didn't need to hear them to know their sound. Gin, Korng, Pew. Scully squared her shoulders as she and Mulder worked their way through the crowd. She could tell by the grim faces in the crowd that something horrible had happened. Then she caught sight of the open door, stained in bright red blood, and her heart sank. The two monks disappeared into the stilted house, but Scully stopped next to Mulder in the doorway. She surveyed the pattern of blood, how it spread upward along the inside of the wooden door. She then turned her gaze downward to the crimson, river-like trail leading into the house. "Carotid artery," she said, half to herself. The blood on the door was well above eye level, which meant the victim had been standing. From the angle and arc of the spatter, Scully knew it could not have been a bullet wound. It had been something sharp, like a knife or a razor blade. "The kill was made here," she continued, slowly strolling forward. She followed the trail of blood, walking as lightly as possible. Scully saw Dr. Fielding hunched near the end of the trail of blood. Fielding was on her knees on the carpet, her face hidden in her hands. The two bodies were on the floor in front of her. "My God," Scully whispered. "Skinned," Fielding said, lifting her head out of her hands. "Every inch removed, along with a fair amount of muscle and interior tissue. I sent for you as soon as I got here. The police are on their way from Rayong. There aren't any full-time officers here in Al-Qud. I figured you were the next best thing." "Christ," Mulder said, standing over the corpses. The entire living room seemed covered in blood. "It's them, right? Alan and Rena Trowbridge." Scully dropped to one knee next to the larger corpse. It was like looking at an animal on a butcher's block. Scully shifted her eyes to the second body. Scully could see strands of Rena's silky dark hair stuck to the bloodied mass that had once been her face. She turned her attention back to the larger corpse's pelvic area and below. "Dr. Fielding, do you have an extra pair of gloves?" Fielding nodded, fishing through the pockets of her coat. Scully took the gloves from her and slid them over her fingers. She reached forward, gently running her index finger over a piece of exposed tibia. There was a sharp groove right above the knee. She found similar grooves higher up, near the pelvic bone. "The place looks pretty trashed," Mulder commented from somewhere behind her. He was carefully picking his way through the small house, searching for clues. Soon the Thai police would arrive, probably along with government investigators from Bangkok. Scully knew that the FBI would not be welcomed in the investigation. Mulder was using the time they had to conduct a quick survey of the crime scene. Likewise, Scully could not count on getting the results of an autopsy. "Dr. Fielding, do you see these grooves and these scratches? The grooves were made by a straight razor. Very controlled, practiced strokes." "And the scratches?" Scully paused a moment longer. "I can't be sure, but I think the killer used a dermatome to skin these bodies." "A dermatome?" Mulder asked. He had paused in front of the Buddhist shrine in the far corner. The shrine seemed the only thing in the room that hadn't been overturned. "Isn't that the tool that skin harvesters use? Like a super-sharp cheese grater?" Scully nodded. "Whoever did this was extremely skilled. He's had some level of medical training, and he's done this many times before." "He?" Mulder asked. "Possibly a she. But it certainly wasn't an it, despite what the crowd outside might think. These incisions follow a controlled, determined pattern. It isn't easy to skin a body. It takes practice and a fair amount of strength. More than that, it takes preparation. Some place to put the skin, some way to carry it away from the scene." "But why?" Fielding asked, her voice weak. "Why the Trowbridges? And why like this?" Scully didn't answer the first part of Fielding's question. She had a sickening feeling that the Trowbridges were killed because of her and Mulder's investigation. The second part of Fielding's question seemed even more obvious. "To feed the legend," Mulder answered for her. He was leaning forward over the Buddhist shrine, both palms gently touching the gold statue's belly. "It's an easy cover for a double murder, and it turns Al-Qud against our investigative efforts. 2 foreigners waking the beast once again. We're going to be on our own from here on out." Fielding rose, taking a deep breath. "I'll go and speak to some of the neighbors. Perhaps someone saw something. In any case, there's nothing more I can do here." Fielding sighed heavily and quietly exited the house, leaving Scully and Mulder alone with the bodies. With practiced clinical detachment, Scully ran her gloved fingers through the pool of blood covering most of the floor, trying to estimate the exact time of death from the consistency of the fluid. Without skin or forensic tools, she had nothing else to go by. "We left them about 3 hours ago," she said out loud. "Whoever did this must have been waiting just outside. Probably watched us leave." "Maybe he's out there now," Mulder commented, "still watching us to see what we do next. Or maybe he thinks he's done what he came here to do, cut off our line of information." Scully rose slowly. She crossed to Mulder's side, watching curiously as he continued to rub the golden Buddha. "Mulder, I'm just glad you're not out there with them. I was expecting you to argue with my conclusions." "Monsters don't search people's houses after they kill them," Mulder said, suddenly straining against the statue. "And they aren't superstitious enough to leave a Buddhist shrine untouched." There was a loud, metallic click, and the front of the statue came loose from its pedestal. Scully was shocked to see that the Buddha was attached to the back of its base by 2 oversized metal hinges. She stared at Mulder as he pushed the statue back, revealing a deep, rectangular hiding place. "Mulder, how did you know?" "Actually," Mulder responded as he reached into the opening, "the lunch menu gave it away. Somtam and cow new are northern delicacies. That led me to believe that Rena Trowbridge was a transplant from the northern regions of the country. But this Buddha has his arms crossed at the waist, palms up. That's usually a southern representation of the master. It didn't make sense to me until I saw the shrine untouched by our killer." He pulled a thick envelope from the pedestal, then stepped back from the shrine. A southern Thai wouldn't think to desecrate a shrine like this. That made it the perfect hiding place. Scully was impressed. She watched eagerly while he opened the envelope and peered inside. "Photographs," he said evenly. "About a dozen, divided into 2 sets. And a few printed pages." He reached inside and removed the photographs. The 2 sets were bundled separately with rubber bands. Mulder crossed to the low lunch table and spread the 2 sets out against the wood. The first set that caught Scully's eye were almost as horrible as the two bodies on the floor. They were pictures of burned patients lying naked on military-style hospital stretchers. Each picture had a date in the corner. All were taken between the years of 1970 and 1973. "Full-thickness napalm burns," she commented. "At least 70% of their bodies. These patients were all terminal, if not post-mortem." She shifted her eyes to the second set of photos. These were of naked men as well, lying on similar hospital stretchers. But none of these men were burned. All seemed in perfect health. The second set of photos had dates as well, but all the dates were the same. June 7th, 1975. Scully paused, noticing that Mulder was frozen in place, staring at two of the photos. One was of a burn victim, the other of one of the unmarred men. He had placed the two photos next to one another on the table. "Mulder?" "Scully, look." Scully leaned close and realized that the burn victim's face was partially recognizable. When she shifted her gaze to the unmarred man, she realized they were photos of the same man. She reread the dates in the corners and shook her head. "These dates must be incorrect. Burns like that don't heal. Even if he did somehow recover, he would have been covered in transplant scars." Mulder didn't seem to be listening. He was carefully arranging the two sets of photos, burn victims next to their unmarred counterparts. An eye here, an ear there, he was using whatever clues he could find to pair them up. When Mulder was finished, he looked at Scully. She shook her head. "I know what you're thinking, but it's impossible. Synthetic skin for limited transplantation, maybe, but nothing like this. This isn't medicine. This is raising the dead. These dates are wrong, Mulder." Mulder turned back to the folder and removed the rest of its contents, 2 printed pages of paper. The first page contained some sort of list, a row of names, numbers, and medical conditions, all divided into columns. Scully quickly recognized that the list was a hospital admission register. The figures were Army serial numbers, and the conditions were all strikingly similar. Burns of various degrees, either from napalm or other chemical-based weapons. None of the patients had burns over less than 50% of their body. Most were charred beyond the 70% range. Again, all were terminal. 130, Mulder said, after a few moments, all horribly burned, like the men in those pictures. Mulder stopped, his brow furrowed. He pointed at one of the names. Scully read it aloud. Andrew Paladin. Napalm burns, full torso, 68% of his face and legs. "Another mistake?" Mulder asked. "It must be," Scully commented, nonplussed. "Or someone's created a long trail of lies. Andrew Paladin could not have survived his brother with burns like that. And if somehow he had survived, he'd be confined to a burn clinic in permanent ICU, not living as a recluse up in the mountains." "Unless those pictures are real," Mulder said, as he turned to the second sheet of paper from the folder. "Unless Paladin's search for his perfect synthetic skin was successful." "Mulder, take a look at this," Mulder interrupted. "It's a map. It looks similar to the map of the MASH unit we have, but this one's got a basement level." Scully took the sheet of paper from him. Indeed, it was a map of the Alkut MASH unit. A second level was superimposed beneath the roughly drawn complex, showing a series of tunnels and underground chambers. But there was no key, no explanation of what they meant. "It might still be there," Mulder said. "The tunnels might still be down there beneath the clinic. Maybe there's more evidence of Paladin's research." Scully watched as Mulder gathered up the photos and list of wounded soldiers and shoved them back into the envelope. He folded the map in half and slid it into his pocket. "It's been 20 years, Scully said. "Even if the tunnels still exist, there won't be anything down there." "It's worth a look." Mulder paused, gesturing toward the 2 mutilated bodies on the floor. "They died for a reason, Scully. They were hiding something, and I think we found it." "What did we find, Mulder?" "Evidence of Paladin's success, and perhaps of his continued success. If the men on that list came into Alkut with 70 and 80% napalm burns and came out like the healthy men in those pictures, then Paladin really did achieve a miracle. But that miracle might have had a price. Why would anyone keep something like this a secret? Why kill innocent people to cover up a miracle? I don't know, but we won't find out standing around here. Scully took the envelope with the photos and hospital admission list out of his hands. All right, as long as we're here, we'll follow this wherever it leads. You search for those tunnels. I'm going to find out what I can about the names on this list. If they died in Alkut, then there's a good chance Andrew Paladin died alongside them. And we just wasted a whole lot of federal money tracking down 2 dead brothers. Mulder's search of the clinic had yielded nothing. The rain had finally slowed to a light drizzle, and he could see breaks in the clouds above the high wooden steeple of the dilapidated church across the street. Mulder started forward, intending to head back to the hotel where Scully was using her laptop computer to research the list of burned soldiers. But as he stepped past the spirit house, he paused, bothered by something across the street. There was a young man standing in the doorway of the church. He was tall and thin, with slicked back hair and caramel skin, wearing a long dark smock with baggy sleeves. He was leaning nonchalantly against the half-open church door, a serene smile on his thin face. As Mulder watched, the young man turned and slipped inside the church. The door clicked shut behind him. Mulder felt his stomach tighten. There was something about the young man that bothered him. He wasn't sure, but he thought he had seen a similar man online at customs in the airport in Bangkok. Mulder realized immediately what this might mean. Then another thought hit him, and he quickly retrieved the folded map from his pocket. He ran his eyes over the map, focusing on the distance between the major structures. He looked at the church, the way it was perched close to the road that separated it from the clinic. He came to a sudden realization. The area where the church was built could have also been part of the MASH unit. Mulder jammed the map back into his pocket and rushed into the street. His heart was racing, and his hand automatically went to his gun. He unbuttoned his holster and let his fingers rest on the grooved handle of his Smith & Wesson. He reached the door to the church, pressing his body against the nearby wall. There was a pile of transparent plastic a few feet away, and he remembered seeing the door covered when he and Scully had first arrived. Mulder placed his free hand against the door and gave it a quick shove. The door swung inward, clanging against the inside wall. He drew his automatic, clicking back the safety. He crouched low and leapt around the doorframe. Mulder was standing at the back of a long rectangular hall with a 20-foot arched ceiling and wood-paneled walls. Mulder quietly slid along the back of the hall, his eyes adjusting to the strange lighting. Near the front of the room, he saw a tangle of wood that used to be the support beams of a stage. The hall seemed deserted. Mulder moved forward carefully, trying to keep track of the floor in front of his feet. Like the clinic, the floor was made of cement. Mulder had nearly reached the destroyed stage when his gaze settled on a pair of thick, forest-green curtains hanging down along the back wall. Between the curtains was a door, attached at a disturbed angle by a single warped hinge. There was easily enough room between the door and the frame for someone to slip through. Mulder hurried his pace, his gun trained on the dark opening. He reached the curtains and knelt next to the broken door. He found himself peering into a dark, descending stairwell. The steps looked worn and scuffed. He smiled, then narrowed his eyes. Caution demanded that he head back to the inn and get Scully. He had no idea what he was going to find in those tunnels. But the longer he waited, the less chance he would find answers. The young man could easily slip away. Mulder shook away his reservations and slipped through the door. The stairs ended about 25 feet below the church, at the mouth of a long tunnel. The tunnel had porcelain-tiled walls, with steel support beams rising out of the cement floor at regular intervals. To Mulder's surprise, the tunnel was well lit by fluorescent light strips set every few yards into the curved ceiling. 10 yards beyond the stairwell, the tunnel branched out in 2 directions. Mulder paused at the fork, his back hard against one of the steel struts rising up along the wall. To the left, the tunnels seemed to go on forever. To the right, the curved walls opened up into some sort of chamber. Mulder exchanged the map for the automatic. Then he swung around the corner and through the entrance to the chamber. The ceiling was higher than in the tunnels, curved like the inside of a tennis ball. Like the tunnels, the walls were covered in porcelain tiles. At the back of the chamber was the opening to what looked to be another tunnel. Mulder's eyes widened as he saw row after row of hospital stretchers taking up most of the sheer cement floor. Each stretcher was partially concealed by a light blue, circular plastic curtain. Next to the stretchers stood chrome IV racks trailing long, yellow rubber IV tubes. The walls on either side of the chamber were lined with high-tech medical equipment, much fancier and certainly more expensive than anything he had seen in Fielding's clinic. Mulder moved forward, counting the partially curtained stretchers. His eyebrows rose as he reached 130, closely packed together in groups of 10 and 20. Altogether, the same number of stretchers as the patients on the Trowbridge's list. Mulder froze as sudden footsteps echoed through the chamber. He spun toward the sound and saw the thin young man standing at the entrance to the chamber. Now that there was less distance between them, he noticed that the boy was of mixed origin. He was a good 2 inches taller than Mulder, and his lithe muscles looked like twisted ropes beneath his skin. The young man's hands were hidden beneath the wide sleeves of his smock. Mulder made sure his gun was clearly visible. "I'm Agent Mulder of the American FBI. I'm going to approach, slowly. Don't make any sudden motions." The young man smiled. There was a loud shuffling from somewhere behind Mulder's right shoulder. Mulder jerked his body to the side and saw 3 men enter the chamber from the opposite entrance. All 3 were tall and looked to be in their early 20s. They had matching crew cuts and seemed to be in excellent physical shape. They moved easily into the room, spreading out as they closed toward Mulder. The largest of the 3 strolled directly toward him, and Mulder noticed that he had something in his right hand, a syringe filled with a clear liquid. Mulder aimed his gun at the man's chest. "Stay where you are." The man continued forward. Mulder realized there was something off about his face. The man's eyes seemed strangely overdilated. He was looking right at Mulder, but he seemed locked in some sort of daze. "Not another step," Mulder warned, flipping the safety off his automatic. "I said stop." The 2 wingmen were within 15 feet, now closing toward him. The man with the syringe was barely 10 feet away. Mulder aimed directly at his chest. Suddenly, all 3 men dove forward. Mulder fired twice, the gun kicking into the air. The lead man jerked back on his feet, then regained his momentum and continued toward Mulder. Before Mulder could fire again, incredibly strong arms grabbed his wrists, twisting his hands behind his back. The Smith & Wesson clattered to the floor. He kicked out, trying desperately to twist free. The man with the syringe leaned over him, and he caught a glimpse of something that sent his terrified mind spinning. The man had a circular red rash on the back of his neck. Mulder felt a sharp prick just above his collarbone. The 3 men suddenly released him, stepping back. Mulder's knees buckled, and he fell. Green clouds swept across his vision, and he felt the cold floor against his cheek. A second later, everything turned black. Scully stared at the open laptop on the desk in front of her. The processor struggled to download her request to the databanks 10,000 miles away. She had laboriously plugged in the list of names, minus Andrew Paladin. Soon the computer would tell her if the men had indeed served in the Vietnam War. She had also asked for Army registration photos, current addresses, and medical records. A series of beeps emanated from the laptop, and Scully sat up in her chair. The list of names began to spill across the screen, followed by concise FBI terminology. At first glance, the data confirmed her suspicions. The men were listed as casualties of the Vietnam War. But Scully noticed a strange discrepancy. The men were all registered as having been killed in action between 1970 and 1973. None were listed as having been transported to any Army MASH unit, let alone the unit in Al Qut. A sudden sound caught her attention, and she looked up from the screen. The sound had come from the other side of the bedroom door. A click of metal against metal, as if someone had tried turning the knob to see if it was locked. "Mulder? Is that you?" Silence. Scully rose from the chair, her heart pounding. Her gun was in its holster, sitting on the bed table. "If someone's out there, please identify yourself." The doorknob exploded inward, a rain of wood splinters and mangled steel spiraling into the room. Scully jerked back, stunned, her hips slamming into the desk. A man was standing in the open doorway, tall, well-built, with a crew cut and high, chiseled features. The man stepped into the room. Scully's eyes drifted downward, and she watched as he drew something out of the right pocket of his slacks. A hypodermic, with a 3-inch long syringe. "Stay where you are," she said in her strongest voice. "I'm a U.S. federal agent." The man didn't seem to hear her. He took another step forward, his dull eyes trained on her face. Scully thought about her gun 15 feet away and realized he would reach her before she was halfway there. She needed to disarm the man before going for her gun. She searched the room rapidly, and her gaze settled on the chest-high lamp a few feet past the edge of the desk. As the man took another step forward, Scully suddenly leapt to the side, grabbing the lamp halfway up its metal base. Without pause, she swung the makeshift weapon in a sweeping arc, aiming for the hypodermic. The goatskin shade toppled away, revealing a naked bulb and exposed wires. There was a flash of light as the bulb hit the syringe dead on. Then a rainbow of bright sparks burst into the air as the steel needle touched the light socket. Scully dropped the lamp and dove for the bed table. She was halfway there when she realized the man wasn't chasing her. She turned and watched him convulse backward, the still sparking lamp lying in front of him, smoke rising from the hypodermic in his hand. The man's knees suddenly went limp, and his body collapsed to the floor. Scully stared, surprised. The syringe had only touched the light socket for a few seconds. The electric shock should have been strong enough to stun the man, but not enough to cause him serious harm. Scully grabbed her gun from the bed table and stepped cautiously toward him. His head was partially to one side, and Scully noticed a red rash on the back of his neck. She stopped a few feet from the collapsed man and lowered herself to one knee. Keeping the gun a careful distance away, she reached forward and checked his pulse. Nothing. She began CPR, pressing as hard as she could against the man's muscular chest. A few minutes into the CPR, she realized it was pointless. The man was dead. Like Perry Stanton, he had been killed by a relatively small jolt of electricity. Scully shifted her gaze to the syringe still clamped in the man's right hand. The clinic. Mulder was there, searching for the underground tunnels. If they had come for Scully, then they must have gone after Mulder as well. A second later, Scully was on her feet and heading for the door. Mulder's eyes came open. His vision swirled, a wave of nausea working upward through his throat. He gagged, trying to lift himself to a sitting position, but his arms were pinned at his sides. He blinked rapidly, letting the yellowish light clear away the fog. He was staring at a curved stone ceiling lined by fluorescent light strips. He realized immediately where he was, the underground chamber. His head fell back against the stretcher. He blinked rapidly, fighting away the nausea. There was a black Velcro belt running around his chest and down beneath the stretcher, holding his arms in place. There was a similar restraint around his ankles. He was completely immobilized. Mulder clenched his teeth and slammed his body back against the stretcher. He was helpless, impotent. Footsteps reverberated through the stretcher beneath him. The curtain whipped back, and Mulder squinted at the apparition standing a few feet away. Over 6 feet tall, long-limbed, with narrow shoulders. The man was wearing light blue scrubs, latex gloves, and a white surgical mask. The only features Mulder could make out were the man's eyes, a flickering, almost transparent blue, like the base of a flame. Could this be Emil Paladin? The man turned and said something in a quiet voice. There were other people in the room just out of view. Gloved hands held out a thin plastic tray. The blue-eyed man took 2 objects from the tray and turned back to Mulder. Mulder's gaze dropped to the man's hands. In the right, he held a steel device shaped like an oversized stapler. Mulder's eyes shifted to the man's other hand. He saw a long pair of steel tweezers delicately gripped around a 4-inch strip of something thin and yellow. The material looked organic and wet, as if it had just been removed from some sort of preserving solution, washed and ready for transplantation. "Wait," Mulder whispered. "You're making a big mistake. They'll send people looking for me." "Put him under. Now." Suddenly, strong hands clamped a rubber gas mask over Mulder's mouth and nose. The second man was also wearing a surgical mask, but Mulder recognized the cubic shape of his head. Julian Kyle. Mulder held his breath, struggling violently. "Take a deep breath," Kyle whispered into his ear. "You won't feel any pain." Mulder arched his back against the Velcro strap. His lungs spasmed, but still he held on. Kyle pressed the mask tighter against his face. "It has to be this way." Mulder saw spots in the corner of his vision, and suddenly he couldn't fight any longer. He gasped, filling his lungs. A sweet taste touched the back of his tongue, and his eyelids fluttered shut. He heard the material of his slacks tearing, and he felt something touching his left calf, something cold and wet. As he flirted with consciousness, a faraway voice swirled in his ear. "He won't cause us any more problems." "And his partner?" came the response. There was a brief pause. When the first voice answered, it had a tinny, almost musical quality. "Something went wrong. It was a mistake to send a first-stage drone on an unobserved mission. We need to send 10... Julian, we don't have time." "But his partner..." "Forget her," the first voice snapped. "We need to head back to the main lab and proceed with the final stage. The satellite link will only allow us a small window for our demonstration." The voices disintegrated as Mulder's limp body settled back against the stretcher. Reality faded away to the rhythmic click, click, click of an oversized steel stapler. Scully sat on the wet front steps of the clinic, staring in frustration at the blueprint open on her lap. It had been more than 2 hours since she had left the hotel, and still she had found no trace of Mulder. She ran her fingers across the center of the blueprint, tracing a shadowy line that she assumed represented Alcut's main road. She had found the blueprint in a booklet printed by the National Tie Power Company. Someone had dug power lines beneath the town's streets, which meant there had to be a better map of the town, and perhaps its underground, than the one provided by the U.S. military. But after 20 minutes of trying to decipher the strange tie notations and the geographic cues that covered most of the power company blueprint, Scully was no longer sure that the map was going to provide much help. The only structures represented clearly on the blueprint were the power lines. The entire map was covered in spiderwebs of bright red ink connected by larger blue trunks. The blue trunks seemed to be focused near the larger town buildings, such as the clinic and the town hall. She saw that 3 of the blue trunks converged within a few centimeters of each other, somewhere close to the clinic. She leaned over the map, trying to decipher the exact location. She suddenly looked up. She stared at the decrepit building across the street. Then she moved her eyes from the steeple to the door, to the heap of plastic sheeting next to the front entrance. She remembered how the sheeting had covered the door. She had assumed that the church was abandoned.
If she had read the blueprint right, there were 3 power lines feeding electricity to the abandoned church across the street. Mulder's throat constricted and he lurched forward, gasping for air. His skull throbbed, and he violently shook his head back and forth, desperate to silence the horrid ringing in his ears. Then his eyes came open, and memory crashed into him with a burst of fluorescent light. He was lying on the same stretcher, in the same underground chamber, but the Velcro straps were gone. The curtain was pulled back, and as far as Mulder could tell, he was alone in the chamber. He noticed, with a start, that his clothes were gone. He was wearing a white hospital smock, and there was a thin rubber tube sticking out of his right arm. Eyes wide, he followed it to a bottle of yellowish liquid hanging from the IV rack above his shoulder. Without thought, he grabbed the tube and yanked it out of his arm. As he stared at the yellow liquid dripping from the detached IV tube, his entire body started to tremble. A strange, crawling feeling was moving up his left leg. It felt like 1,000 worms twitching through his skin. He clenched his teeth and yanked the smock up. 12 oversized staples were sticking out from his calf, winding down toward his Achilles tendon. To his surprise, the yellow strip below the staples had shriveled into a hard mass, barely touching the skin beneath. Mulder quickly grabbed the withered slab and yanked as hard as he could. It tore free, dragging half the staples with it. Blood ran freely down his calf, but he barely noticed. He was staring at the failed transplant, relief billowing through him. As he pressed the slab between his fingers, it disintegrated into a fine dust. He carefully tore a strip of material from the bottom of his smock and wrapped it tightly around his calf. The bleeding slowed, and although he could still feel the few remaining staples, he barely felt any pain. He shifted his legs off the stretcher, ignoring the dull pounding in his skull. His feet touched the cold cement floor, and a new shiver moved up through his shoulders. He rose, slowly, and staggered through the open curtain that surrounded his stretcher. He reached the far wall of the chamber and paused, his eyes shifting across the medical machinery. He drifted past the computer screens and noticed a small steel file cabinet by the last monitor. The cabinet was barely waist-high, so mundane he hadn't noticed it before. Mulder began rifling through the drawers. Within a few seconds, he had forgotten about the pounding in his skull and the blood still soaking through the loose tourniquet around his calf. He had reached the back half of the second drawer when he stopped, drawing out a familiar sheet of paper. It was the same list of 130 soldiers he had found beneath the Golden Buddha. But in this list, there was a difference. One of the names was crossed off. Next to the name was a small, handwritten note. Dopamine inhibitor deficiency due to IV malfunction. Began cardiac convulsions shortly after 2 a.m. en route to in-house demonstration. Drone escaped custody shortly afterward. Mulder turned back to the file cabinet. Near the back of the same drawer, his fingers hit a thick sheaf of pages. As he lifted the sheaf free, he saw that the front page was another copy of the familiar list. But as he turned the pages, his pulse quickened. The list did not end at 130 names. It was 16 pages long. Mulder quickly did the calculations. Over 2,000 soldiers, all designated as napalm burn victims brought to Alkut between 1970 and 1973. His mind whirling, Mulder opened the last drawer to the filing cabinet. The drawer was filled with photocopies of MRI scans. He pulled a handful free, leafing through them. "Mulder!" Mulder nearly dropped the scans as he whirled on his heels. He saw Scully rushing across the chamber. Mulder tried to stand when a rush of dizziness knocked him back to a crouch. He leaned against the cabinet as Scully dropped to his side. She took in the hospital smock, then saw the bloody tourniquet around his calf. She quickly slid her gun back into its holster and put the back of her hand against his neck, checking his pulse. Mulder tried to smile. His head was pounding worse than before. "I'm fine. A little elective surgery, that's all." "Elective?" Scully asked, as her fingers probed beneath the edge of the makeshift tourniquet.
As you can imagine, my vote was in the minority. Scully's concern abated slightly as she discerned that the wound was minor. Then she shifted her attention to the small puncture where he had pulled out the IV. "Do you know what you were given?" "Over there, by the stretcher. The yellowish liquid. I think it was some sort of dopamine inhibitor." Scully raised her eyebrows. "That would explain your sluggishness. But what makes you think that?" Mulder showed her the first list with the handwritten notation. "According to this, one of the transplant patients died from a lack of dopamine inhibitor. I believe all the transplant recipients have to get periodic infusions of the inhibitor to keep them from going psychotic." Scully stared at him. "All the transplant recipients? Are you implying they tried to transplant skin onto my calf? Thankfully, the procedure was a failure. But they didn't know that and hooked me up to the inhibitor." Mulder handed Scully the MRI scans and watched as she leafed through them. "The hypothalamuses are enlarged," she said, "like Stanton. And look at this. The motor cortex has nearly doubled in size, while the amygdala has become almost non-existent." Mulder raised his eyebrows, confused. "The motor cortex and the amygdala?" "The motor cortex is the part of the brain associated with involuntary reflex and motor control," Scully explained, still staring at the MRIs. "The amygdala is associated with personality and thought. If these MRIs are real, then the people whose brains have been photographed would be almost automatons." "Drones," Mulder interrupted. "They can follow simple commands. They can be controlled. Unless they don't get their dopamine inhibitor and turn out like Perry Stanton." Scully paused, still looking at the MRIs. "If your list is to be believed, our John Doe arrived here in Alcut, along with 129 others, more than 25 years ago, burned almost to death. You're saying that all these men have been turned into drones?" Mulder paused. "That's just the beginning." He showed her the list of 2,000 names. Her eyes widened as she flipped through the pages. Scully shook her head. "Impossible. The logistics alone would be incredible. These men would have to be kept in an intensive care facility, someplace really big, with enough financing to last more than 2 decades. And for what purpose?" Mulder slowly struggled to his feet, using Scully's arm for balance. "I don't think the drones are the final product. They were the first stage, the prototype. Paladin must be planning to create something much more valuable." "So you're convinced that Paladin's search for synthetic skin led to all of this?" Mulder paused. He had been developing a theory since his trip to the temple. "It's not synthetic. It's scavenged." He started across the chamber. Scully followed alongside. "What do you mean?" "Trowbridge told us that Paladin was a devoted student of Thai mythology. I think Paladin knew about the Skin Eater before he ever came to Alcut. He went looking for the creature and has been using its skin as the source of his transplants." Scully shook her head. "It has to be synthetic, Mulder. Some sort of chemical structure that interacts with the patient's bloodstream, spreading into the muscle control centers of the brain. An extremely elastic and inviolable substance, except to electricity. Electricity passes right through the skin into the nervous system itself, setting off a cardiac reaction." Mulder raised his eyebrows. "I had an encounter with one of these men," Scully explained, "in my hotel room. He went into cardiac arrest after shoving a hypodermic needle into a light socket." "If these men are just the beginning," Scully continued, "what's next?" Mulder wasn't sure, but the sinking feeling in his gut told him where they would have to go to find out. If Emil Paladin is experimenting on 2,000 missing soldiers, he needs a private, secluded place to work. A place where no one would dare bother him. Scully exhaled at his obvious attempt at melodrama. But Mulder was sure she was thinking along the same lines. As soon as he recovered his balance, they would be heading into the mountains that surrounded Alcut, searching for a secret intensive care unit and the mythological lair of Gin Korng Pugh, the Skin Eater. "The key is in the wrist," Mulder grunted, bringing his machete down in a vicious arc. Scully swung her own machete, severing a branch almost half her length. "It's getting pretty dark," she commented, as she stepped over the freshly cut branch and went to work on the next obstacle. "We'll have to make camp soon, and wait for Malku to return, unless you think we can find our way back ourselves." They had left Alkut with a group of porters, but as they had gotten closer to the cave, the men had refused to continue. Their guide, the young monk from the temple, had left to take the men back, promising to return as soon as he could. Mulder moved alongside, slashing deep into the fingers of green. "I'm not ready to give up yet." "It's not a matter of giving up," Scully said, chopping into the bush with frustrated swipes. "It's a matter of being reasonable. Shit!" Scully watched as the machete slipped out from her sweaty fingers and somersaulted through a breach in the thick bush. The blade quickly disappeared from view, and a second later there was a loud clatter of metal against stone. Mulder's face brightened. That sounded promising. Scully delicately stepped after the machete, working her way between the minced branches. To her surprise, the other side of the bush opened into a brief, rock-strewn plain, stretching upward in a gentle slope. Other than a few knee-high bushes, the ground was clear of significant obstructions. Just on the other side of the plain, Scully saw sheer rock cliffs rising almost straight up, disappearing into the charcoal sky. They had reached the base of Si Dum Cow. "Scully," Mulder whispered, his cheek almost touching hers. "Over there." He gestured toward a huge black oval carved directly into the sheer cliff, about 30 yards away. It was the mouth of a vast cave. The opening was at least 20 feet high, with a span nearly twice as wide. Twisting green vines hung down across the cave entrance. "It looks deserted," Scully commented. They made short work of the rocky glade, angling along the sheer cliff toward the opening. Scully carefully unslung the automatic rifle and handed it to Mulder. Then she withdrew her handgun. Without a word, Mulder slid between two of the vines and into the dark cave. Beyond the entrance, the cave opened up into an oval chamber similar in size to the laboratory beneath the church. Directly across the room was another arched opening leading deeper into the mountain. A yellowish light trickled across the stone floor, coming from somewhere beyond the second entrance. Scully could not tell for sure, but the light seemed artificial. As they moved closer to the yellowish light, unnatural, vaguely mechanical sounds drifted into her ears. Soon the sounds reached a recognizable volume. She clearly made out the rhythmic pumping of respiratory ventilators, mingling with the hiss of liquid infusers and the beep of computer processors. She cautioned Mulder with her hand as they reached the entrance, and they spread out to either side, crouching low. The inner room was at least 4 times as large as the initial chamber, massive and naturally domed, nearly the size of a football field. Soft yellow light poured down from more than a dozen enormous spotlights hanging from steel poles suspended along the walls, and beginning just a few feet in front of Scully, stretching as far as her eyes could see, row after row of empty chrome hospital stretchers. "They're not here," Mulder whispered, slowly moving between the stretchers. "These stretchers are all empty." He paused mid-sentence. Then he pointed up ahead. There was a group of stretchers, between 20 and 30, situated near the far end of the cavern. Each of the stretchers was covered by a milky white oxygen tank. Mulder rushed ahead, Scully a few feet behind. Their pace slowed as they reached the first oxygen tent. At the head of each tent stood a semicircle of medical carts. Tubes ran from the carts to valves attached directly to the plastic oxygen tents. Scully took a deep breath and approached the closest plastic tent. She could hear the rhythm of the oxygen being pumped through the tubing, creating a pristine, sterile environment inside. She searched the outside of the plastic tent and found a triangular flap held down by a steel zipper. She called Mulder over and carefully undid the flap. "My God," she whispered, as she stared through the thin, transparent plastic viewplate beneath the flap. She was looking at a horribly burned face and upper torso. Nearly every inch of skin had been seared away, and in many places she could see straight through to the muscle and bone beneath. Both eyes were burned away, leaving blank sockets, and the patient's mouth was wide open and missing all of its teeth. But amazingly, the patient seemed to be still alive. Scully could see the mechanical rise and fall of his chest. Still alive, in a sense. More an organic machine than a human being. "This one's in the same condition," Mulder called to her from a few feet away. He had opened a similar flap on another oxygen tent. As Scully watched, he moved from stretcher to stretcher, carefully unzipping the flaps. 25 of them, all in similar states. The rest of the 2,000 must have been moved, maybe to other holding areas. Scully tore herself away from the stretcher and followed Mulder through the chamber. Suddenly, Mulder grabbed her arm and yanked her to the side. She gasped, nearly losing her footing. Mulder was pointing straight ahead. They were barely 20 yards from the back wall of the enormous chamber. A double door had been cut directly into the stone, and there was a circular viewing window set waist-high in one of the doors, a few feet in diameter. Bright light poured through the window, and Scully could see movement on the other side. "Over there," Mulder mouthed, pointing toward a pair of huge autoclaves, enormous steam sterilizers, each about the size of a small closet with a transparent plexiglass face. One of the autoclaves was open, its digital display glowing red, indicating that it was set on automatic and ready for operation. The other looked like it had been recently used. She crouched next to Mulder behind the second autoclave, craning her neck for a better angle through the viewing window. "Looks like an operating theater," she whispered. "Theater's the right word," Mulder responded. "Do you see the cameras?" Scully nodded. From her angle, she could see at least 3 video cameras on tripods focused on the raised operating table on the other side of the window. A tall, thin man in surgical garb was speaking into one of the cameras, his face covered by a sterile white mask. Another man was hovering closer to the operating table. In his hands was an oversized plastic cooler, partially opened. "Julian Kyle," Scully commented, snapping the safety off of her Smith & Wesson. "What do you suppose the cameras are for?" "It's a satellite link," Mulder responded. His fingers had tightened against his automatic rifle. "I heard them talking about it before I went unconscious. They're demonstrating their procedure, probably to interested buyers." "Do-it-yourself drones?" Scully asked. "Like I said before," Mulder responded, "the drones were just the first step. The procedure has been perfected, and the next stage is in that room." Scully nodded, and Mulder slid forward. Scully followed a step behind, her focus trained on the double doors. Another few seconds, and it would all be over. Kuo Tian's face suddenly drained of color as he watched the 2 agents sweep out from behind the autoclave. He was standing 20 feet away in the dark entrance to a secondary tunnel leading off from the main chamber. He could not believe the sight in front of him. The male agent had somehow escaped the effects of the transplant procedure. Now he and his partner were here, in Tian's playground, seconds away from ruining everything. Tian slid forward, his hands breaking free of his long sleeves. In his left hand, he held a compact stun gun. His right hand embraced the hilt of his straight razor. Scully saw the sudden flash of movement and jerked her head to the side. The thin young man was sprinting toward them. Scully saw the stun gun, pointing right at her. She didn't have time to get her gun around, didn't even have time to scream. Instead, she did the only thing she could think of. She reached out and grabbed Mulder's shoulder. The bolt of electricity hit her in the side, and there was an enormous popping in her ears. Her body lifted a few inches off the ground, and her muscles spasmed, sending her careening into Mulder. He jerked beneath her hand as half the electricity transferred to his body. The automatic rifle whirled out of his hands, clattering beneath a stretcher a few feet away. Together they slammed into the stone wall, just inches from the double doors.
Scully's skin felt like it was on fire, black spots ricocheting across the plane of her vision. She felt Mulder roll free from beneath her, crawling toward his gun. Her cheek touched the floor, and the room turned to liquid in front of her eyes. She blinked rapidly, struggling to remain conscious. She had avoided the full effect of the stun gun by grabbing Mulder, but she had partially incapacitated them both. She saw Mulder a few feet away, his hands inches from the rifle. Then she saw a long, dark shape land on top of him, a shadow come to life. The shadow dragged Mulder back from the gun and spun him onto his back. Scully shook her head, her vision clearing. The shadow flickered into 3 dimensions. It was the young man, straddling Mulder around his waist, the razor blade rising above Mulder's face. Scully clenched her jaw and launched herself forward. She slammed into the young man's back, knocking him off Mulder with her weight. Even before they hit the ground, the young man had twisted out of her grip. The back of his left hand caught the side of Scully's jaw, and she spun across the floor, crashing into a semicircle of medical carts. She tasted blood and felt the sharp pain of a pulled muscle daggering down her right side. One of the carts had collapsed on top of her, and a cardiac machine was lying shattered next to her shoulder. A long plastic tube had yanked free from the machine, and Scully saw a sharp steel wire sticking out of the end of the tube, a trocar used to insert an emergency cardiac balloon into a patient. The hollow steel wire was 8 inches long with an extremely sharp point. Scully grabbed the trocar, yanking it free from the plastic tube. The sharp pain in her side sent tears to her eyes as she struggled into a crouch. Mulder was on his knees, his hands clenched around the Amerasian's wrists. There was blood pouring from a gash in Mulder's cheek, more blood from a deep cut in his left arm. The Amerasian clearly had the upper hand. The bloody razor blade was moving steadily toward Mulder's throat. Scully clenched her hand around the trocar and hurtled forward. The Amerasian looked up at the last second, his eyes going wide. He tried to twist his body out of the way, but the trocar caught the side of his shoulder and plunged through, ripping deep into his muscle, wounding him severely. The Amerasian lurched to his feet, his eyes wild. His feet tangled together, and he fell, crashing into the open autoclave. His weight sent the machine rocking backward, and the door swung shut. There was a mechanical click, followed by a series of loud beeps. Scully's stomach dropped as she realized the machine was set on automatic. She lurched toward the control panel, but she was too late. Suddenly, a thunderous hiss erupted from the machine. Plumes of superheated steam exploded out of the half-dozen sterilizing jets, hitting the young man from all 4 sides. His skin was instantly flayed from his body, tearing off in long, bloody strips. In less than a second, he had been reduced to a skeleton, shrouded in white steam. Scully stared in shock. Mulder staggered to his feet next to her. "Karma," he said simply. 2,000 degrees of pure karma. Scully looked at him. The blood flowed freely down his face from the cut in his cheek. Was that Emil Paladin's son? Before Mulder could answer, there was the sound of a swinging door behind them. Scully turned and saw Julian Kyle staring at them from in front of the double doors. He had the plastic cooler in his hands, and there was a shocked look on his face. "Stay where you are!" Mulder shouted, but Kyle was already sprinting across the chamber. Mulder ignored him, heading toward the double doors. "Scully, don't let him get away! He's got the skin!" Mulder crashed through the twin doors shoulder first, bursting into the bright light. The raised operating table was 10 feet away, surrounded by surgical equipment. Anesthetic tanks stood by the head of the table, next to a respirator pump and 2 enormous canisters of oxygen. On the other side of the table, Mulder recognized the articulated arm and cylindrical housing of a high-powered laser scalpel. The blue-eyed man in the surgical mask stood frozen beside the table, a scalpel in his right hand. 3 separate video cameras were trained over his shoulders toward the operating table. "Sorry to interrupt the show," Mulder said, breathing hard in the doorway. The blue-eyed man remained still, a strange calm moving across his features. His eyes shifted to the patient on the table in front of him. Mulder followed his gaze. The patient was a work in progress. His bare torso was split into two distinct sections. His abdomen was still covered in terrible burns, but his upper pectorals, shoulders, neck, and face had been delicately reconstructed. The new, yellowish skin was pulled taut against his muscles and bone. At the edges of each newly transplanted section, Mulder could make out the thin staples, and spread around the staples, tiny flecks of red powder. Beneath the fresh skin, the patient's face was unnaturally smooth. His eyes were wide open, the same piercing blue as the surgeon by his side. Mulder realized with a start that he recognized the patient's face. Andrew Paladin. He shifted his gaze back to the masked surgeon. The blue-eyed man moved slowly to one of the video cameras behind him and hit a switch. The cameras stopped whirring. "You've disturbed a delicate procedure. This man could die because of you." "This man should have died a long time ago," Mulder responded, slowly moving around the operating table, his eyes flickering toward the scalpel. "There are 25 just like him imprisoned in the next room, and there are close to 2,000 more hidden somewhere suffering the same horrid fate." The blue-eyed man took a step back from the operating table, the scalpel poised expertly in his gloved hand. "Those men are alive because of me. My skin will give them a second chance, a way out from the torture." Mulder shook his head. "You mean turn them into slaves, drones?" The blue-eyed man backed between the two oxygen tanks as Mulder skirted the bottom corner of the operating table. "No," Mulder continued, "that was just the first stage. But the next stage, it's something much more advanced, isn't it? Much more valuable." "This is beyond you," the blue-eyed man said, his voice indifferent. "You can't possibly begin to understand. I know that you've kept these men alive for the past 15 years. Medically, that seems impossible. So it must be the skin itself, or perhaps chemicals within the skin, that has made this longevity possible. You've used the skin to alter these men, to prepare them for this demonstration." Mulder paused, looking at the patient on the stretcher. "Soldiers. Intelligent, invulnerable soldiers. That's what you're trying to create, isn't it? And you intend to sell them to the military. Who's on the other end of the cameras?" The blue-eyed man's face tensed as his left hand suddenly slipped into his coat pocket. When it reappeared, he was holding a small caliber handgun. "That's enough," he said quietly. It was more than a statement. It was a command. Looking at the man's face, at the intensity of his gaze, Mulder was struck by a sudden thought. This man's motivation came from within, from his own obsessions, his own unquenchable ego. Mulder glanced back at the cameras, at the operating table, and he realized it didn't make sense. "It's not about money at all," he finally said. "The men who are funding you might think that's what you're after, but that's not it. You're chasing something else, something much more powerful than money." He thought about the first-stage drones, men who should have died during the Vietnam War, men who still appeared as young as they had the day they were injured. "Immortality," he whispered, his eyes widening. "Invulnerable soldiers are just the beginning. The skin is ageless, immortal, like the skin eater itself. That's what you're after, isn't it? Immortality." Mulder ducked to the left just as the gun went off. He felt something slam into his right shoulder, and he was whirled off of his feet. He hit the floor, rolling as fast as his wounded body could manage. A second shot exploded against the floor by his feet, sending up a plume of shattered stone. Mulder scrambled the other way, his mind churning as he partially concealed himself beneath the raised operating table. He could hear the blue-eyed man circling the operating table toward him, and he crawled in the opposite direction. 2,000 regenerating sources of immortality, Mulder said, his voice low, "including your own brother." There was an audible cough, and Mulder's shoulders trembled. He had been correct all along. Emil Paladin was the man behind the surgical mask. Mulder leaned back against the operating table, the pain from his gunshot wound sapping his energy. He felt his head falling forward, when he noticed a rounded pedal just a few inches from his right foot. He followed the pedal to its cylindrical root and realized he was lying a few feet from the base of a laser scalpel. He heard Paladin circling around the head of the operating table. He closed his eyes, imagining the man's position. He pictured the articulated arm with the attached laser. He tensed his aching muscles, forcing his body to coil inward. He counted the seconds, listening as the footsteps moved closer and closer and closer. Suddenly, Mulder leapt out from under the operating table and rose to his full height. Paladin reared back, stunned, the gun sweeping upward. Before Paladin could pull the trigger, Mulder slapped at the steel arm with his open right hand. The mechanical arm sprang forward on its hinged springs. At the same moment, Mulder's foot came down hard on the control pedal, and there was a loud electric snap. The red guiding light flickered out toward a spot a few inches past the blue-eyed man's shoulder. Mulder's eyes went wide as he watched the light land directly on the rubber gasket at the top of one of the oversized oxygen tanks by the head of the operating table. There was a moment of frozen time, followed by a blinding flash of white light. Mulder was thrown backwards as the oxygen tank exploded. A searing heat licked his face as a sphere of flame billowed out from the eruption point, instantly consuming Paladin from behind. The fiery sphere continued to expand, enveloping the operating table, licking at the canisters of anesthetic gas. Mulder crashed back into the wall, covering his head with his hands as a second explosion rocked the operating room. Something hit Mulder in the stomach, driving the air out of him. He doubled forward, gasping, the heat singeing the hairs on the back of his neck. And just as suddenly, the heat evaporated as the oxygen burned out. Mulder staggered to his feet, staring at the devastated room. Medical machinery lay strewn against the walls, most of the devices charred beyond recognition. Andrew Paladin was nothing more than a curled, blackened shape. The anesthetic gas inside his lungs had obviously ignited, engulfing him from the inside. Mulder stumbled forward, his eyes searching for the man who had started it all. He stepped over the smoking remains of the cardiac monitor, wincing as the motion exacerbated the pain in his right shoulder. His gaze moved back to the floor, and he stopped dead. Mulder? My God, what the hell happened in here? Mulder stared down at the blackened, mangled thing on the floor by his feet. Emil Paladin. Though you'll have to take my word for it, there's even less of him to autopsy this time around. Mulder looked up. Scully was gingerly touching a burnt corner of the operating table. There was dried blood on her lower lip, and her red hair was matted with sweat. What about Julie and Kyle? And the cooler of skin? Scully shook her head. Kyle got away. The tunnels go on for miles into the base of the mountain. It could take days to search them all. We need to get back to Alcud and call Washington, then bring in the military. The military, Mulder repeated. He glanced at the ruined video cameras. The military may be less than helpful. Scully moved carefully into the room, her eyes focused on Mulder's shoulder wound. We may never know the truth behind Paladin's synthetic skin, but we've put an end to his experiments. Mulder sighed, letting Scully's expert fingers probe his bared shoulder. Another case without closure, Scully. Without any hard evidence to take back with us. Scully finished with his shoulder and stepped away. Actually, on my way back to the chamber, I did find something, but I'm not sure what it means. Mulder felt the fatigue disappear from his body. Show me. 20 minutes later, Mulder stood next to Scully in a small alcove near the center of the network of tunnels, staring up at two objects embedded in the stone wall. Finally, Scully broke the silence. I can think of a number of plausible explanations." Mulder didn't respond. To him, no explanations were needed. Scully could subject the objects to every possible abuse in her scientific arsenal, and it wouldn't make any difference. To Mulder, they were an explanation in themselves. Their meaning was as terrifying, abrupt, and obvious as their appearance. Mulder shivered, then slowly turned away. Scully remained behind, staring uneasily at the pair of crisscrossing, razor-sharp tusks.
We hope you've enjoyed this program from Harper Audio. To order additional cassettes or to receive a complete catalog of Harper Audio and Cadman titles, please call us at 1-800-331-3761. That's 1-800-331-3761. Thank you.